The last hunt. The morning air bit through Marcus Chen's thermal layers as he stepped off the charter plane onto the gravel airstrip at Kodiak Ridge, Alaska. The remote airfield, carved into a valley between towering peaks, served as the gateway to some of North America's most pristine and dangerous wilderness. Marcus adjusted his camera equipment bag and breathed in the sharp October air, already feeling the familiar mixture of excitement and apprehension that came with entering bear country during the height of feeding season. "Welcome to the edge of civilization," called out Jake Morrison, the bush pilot who'd flown them in. At 52, Jake had been flying into remote Alaskan locations for over 2 decades, his weathered face telling stories of countless encounters with the untamed wilderness. His blue eyes, sharp as glacial ice, scanned the surrounding tree line with the practiced caution of someone who understood that nature here didn't forgive mistakes. Marcus shouldered his pack, feeling the weight of his professional-grade cameras, telephoto lenses and survival gear. As a wildlife photographer for National Geographic, he documented predators across 6 continents, but Alaska's brown bears represented the apex of his career ambitions. These coastal giants, some weighing over 1,500 pounds, were among the largest land predators on Earth. "How long until pickup?" Marcus asked, checking his GPS coordinates against the laminated map Jake had provided. 14 days, weather permitting," Jake replied, securing the plane's tie-downs against the constant wind that swept down from the glaciated peaks. "But Marcus, you know the drill out here. Weather changes fast, and if a storm system moves in from the Gulf, it could be longer." Dr. Sarah Mitchell emerged from the plane's cargo hold, her auburn hair whipping in the Arctic breeze. At 38, she was one of North America's leading bear behavior specialists, having spent 12 years studying ursine populations across Alaska and Western Canada. Her research on brown bear feeding patterns and territorial behavior had become the definitive text in her field, but this expedition represented something more personal. A chance to document the mysterious hunting behaviors she'd only glimpsed in previous studies. "The weather forecast shows a high-pressure system holding for at least a week," Sarah said, consulting her satellite phone's weather app. "But Jake's right. Conditions can deteriorate rapidly this time of year." Behind her, 3 more team members began unloading equipment and supplies. Thomas Brennan, a 41-year-old survival expert and guide, had spent 15 years leading expeditions into Alaska's most remote regions. His company, Wilderness Ventures, specialized in supporting scientific research teams and extreme wildlife photography expeditions. Thomas moved with the fluid confidence of someone completely at home in the wilderness, his movements economical and purposeful as he organized their gear. "Camp establishment is priority 1, Thomas announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone whose decisions could mean life or death. "We need shelters secured and food properly stored before we even think about venturing beyond base camp." Rebecca Santos, 29, served as the expedition's communications specialist and emergency medical technician. Her compact frame belied her strength. Developed through years of rock climbing and mountaineering, Rebecca had joined the team after completing her emergency medicine residency, seeking adventure before settling into a traditional medical practice. Her medical bag contained advanced trauma supplies, including hemostatic agents, emergency surgical tools, and satellite emergency beacons. The final team member, David Kim, 26, was a graduate student in wildlife biology, completing his doctoral dissertation on predator-prey dynamics in subarctic ecosystems. This expedition represented the culmination of 3 years of research, and his nervous energy was palpable as he checked and rechecked his data collection equipment. Jake finished his pre-flight inspection and gathered the team around a detailed topographical map spread across the plane's wing. "Your base camp coordinates are here," he pointed to a red X marked on the map. Approximately 8 miles southeast of this airstrip, the area is known locally as Salmon Creek Basin, prime brown bear habitat during the salmon run. Marcus studied the map intently, noting the elevation contours, water sources, and dense forest coverage. What's the current bear population estimate for this drainage? Conservative estimate puts it around 15 to 20 individual bears using this watershed system, Sarah replied, consulting her field notes. But during peak salmon season, we could encounter significantly higher concentrations. Jake folded the map and handed it to Thomas. Emergency protocols are non-negotiable out here. Your satellite beacon has my emergency frequency programmed. If you activate it, I'll respond immediately, weather permitting. But understand, if conditions deteriorate, extraction could be delayed 24 to 48 hours. The gravity of their isolation settled over the group. The nearest road system was over 200 miles away, and the closest community, a native village of fewer than 300 people, lay 60 miles to the northeast. They were entering a landscape where human presence was not just rare, it was almost non-existent. Thomas began distributing bear spray canisters and reviewing safety protocols. Everyone carries spray at all times, safety off, ready to deploy. Minimum safe distance from bears is 100 yards for observation, 300 yards if cubs are present. If we encounter a bear at close range, do not run. Stand tall, speak calmly, and back away slowly while avoiding direct eye contact. As Jake performed final equipment checks on his plane, Marcus assembled his camera gear, mounting a 600mm telephoto lens on his primary camera body. The specialized wildlife photography equipment represented over $60,000 in professional gear, designed to capture intimate moments with dangerous predators from safe distances. Your telephoto range should keep you well outside danger zones, Sarah observed, watching Marcus adjust his camera settings. But remember, bears can cover ground faster than you might expect. A brown bear can reach speeds of 35 miles per hour in short bursts. David unpacked his research equipment, motion-activated trail cameras, GPS tracking devices, and digital scales for measuring fish remains and scat samples. His research focused on how environmental factors influenced brown bear hunting success rates and territorial behavior patterns. I'll be placing cameras at strategic locations throughout the drainage, David explained, showing the team his equipment. The goal is to document natural hunting behaviors without human interference. Rebecca organized medical supplies and communication equipment, testing the satellite phone's signal strength and GPS accuracy. Emergency medical evacuation by helicopter would require a minimum 4-hour response time under optimal conditions, she informed the group. In severe weather, ground evacuation could take days. The weight of their isolation became more apparent as Jake completed his departure preparations. Once the plane lifted off, they would be entirely dependent on their own skills, equipment, and judgment for survival. Remember, Thomas addressed the group as they shouldered their packs for the 8-mile hike to base camp, we're visitors in their territory. Brown bears have inhabited this region for thousands of years. Our survival depends on respecting that fact. The hike to base camp followed an ancient game trail that wound through dense stands of Sitka spruce and western hemlock. The forest floor, carpeted with moss and fallen leaves, muffled their footsteps as they navigated around massive fallen trees and across crystal-clear mountain streams. The air carried the rich scents of decomposing vegetation, wild berries, and the distant smell of spawning salmon. Marcus paused frequently to photograph the pristine wilderness, capturing images of towering trees whose trunks measured 8 feet in diameter and eagles soaring overhead with wingspans exceeding 7 feet. The scale of this landscape dwarfed human presence, creating a humbling sense of vulnerability. The salmon run should be peaking right about now, Sarah observed, kneeling beside a creek to examine the gravel bottom. Water temperature and daylight cycles trigger the spawning behavior. The bears know this timing instinctively. Thomas checked his GPS coordinates against the topographical map, confirming their progress toward the designated campsite. We're making good time. Another 3 miles and we'll reach Salmon Creek. The sound of rushing water grew louder as they approached the creek, and soon they could hear the distinctive splashing of jumping salmon fighting their way upstream to spawning grounds. The creek, running fast and clear over a rocky bottom, provided the perfect habitat for both salmon and the bears that depended on them. "This is exactly what we came for," Marcus said, adjusting his camera settings for the changing light conditions beneath the forest canopy. Prime hunting habitat. David immediately began noting environmental observations in his field journal: water temperature, current speed, salmon species identification, and indicators of recent bear activity. Fresh tracks in the creekside mud told the story of recent visitors: massive paw prints measuring nearly 12 inches long and 8 inches wide. "These tracks are less than 24 hours old," Thomas observed, kneeling beside the clear impressions. "Large male, probably 8 to 9 feet tall when standing upright. Weight estimate around 1,300 pounds. Sarah photographed the tracks for documentation, using a measuring tape to record exact dimensions. The track pattern suggests he was moving slowly along the creek bank, probably fishing. See how the rear paws registered partially over the front paw prints? That's typical hunting behavior. The base camp location, situated on a slight rise approximately 100 yards from the creek, provided excellent observation opportunities while maintaining safe distance from primary bear travel corridors. Thomas directed camp establishment with military precision, ensuring proper food storage, waste disposal, and defensive positioning. Bear-proof food containers go in the cache at least 200 yards downwind from camp, Thomas instructed, pointing toward a predetermined location. Cooking area remains separate from sleeping area. All toiletries, toothpaste, and scented items get stored with the food. Rebecca established the communication station, positioning the satellite antenna for optimal signal reception and testing emergency beacon functionality. "Signal strength is good. I've got clear contact with Jake and emergency services coordination in Anchorage." As evening approached, the team gathered around their portable camping stove for dinner, sharing their first meal in bear country. The conversation focused on tomorrow's research plans and photography objectives, but an underlying tension permeated the group: the awareness that they were now truly in the domain of one of North America's most powerful predators. "Tomorrow we'll begin systematic observation of the fishing areas," Sarah outlined, consulting her research protocols. "I want to document hunting success rates, feeding duration, and social interactions between individual bears." Marcus reviewed his shooting schedule, planning optimal positions for wildlife photography. Early morning and late evening provide the best light conditions. Bears are typically most active during these periods anyway. David prepared his trail cameras for deployment, programming motion sensors and checking battery levels. "I'll position cameras at strategic locations along game trails and fishing spots. The goal is 24-hour monitoring of bear behavior patterns." As darkness settled over the wilderness, the team retreated to their individual shelters, but sleep came uneasily. The forest around them came alive with sounds: the distant splash of salmon jumping, the eerie call of loons across hidden lakes, and occasionally the deep huffing sounds that might indicate large mammals moving through the darkness. Marcus lay in his sleeping bag, camera equipment within arm's reach, listening to the symphony of wilderness sounds. Years of wildlife photography had taught him to distinguish between normal forest activity and potential threats, but the acoustic landscape of Alaska's bear country represented an entirely different level of intensity. Around midnight, a series of loud splashing sounds from the creek drew everyone's attention. Thomas emerged from his shelter with night vision equipment, scanning the fishing areas for movement. "Definitely something large working the creek," he whispered to the others. "Could be our first visitor." Through the night vision scope, a massive dark shape moved along the creek bank, occasionally entering the water to investigate pools where salmon congregated. The bear's movements appeared methodical and practiced, suggesting an experienced fisherman working familiar territory. "Magnificent," Sarah breathed, observing through her own night vision equipment. "That's probably the male whose tracks we saw earlier. He's establishing territorial presence." The bear continued fishing for nearly 2 hours, successfully catching and consuming multiple salmon before eventually disappearing into the forest. For the research team, it represented their first confirmation that the area supported exactly the kind of bear activity they'd come to document. Dawn broke crisp and clear, with morning temperatures hovering just above freezing. Frost covered the surrounding vegetation, and their breath formed visible clouds in the Arctic air. Marcus emerged from his shelter before sunrise, preparing camera equipment for the optimal morning light conditions. "Perfect photography weather," he observed, checking his lens for condensation. "Clear skies and excellent visibility." Thomas prepared breakfast while conducting a thorough inspection of the camp perimeter, looking for any signs of overnight visitors. "No evidence of bears investigating camp," he reported. "Our scent control and food storage protocols are working." Sarah and David began their first systematic survey of the creek system, documenting salmon populations, water conditions, and signs of bear activity. The creek bottom showed clear evidence of intensive fishing, partially consumed salmon carcasses, disturbed gravel, and fresh scat deposits. "Bear scat analysis can tell us a lot about diet composition and health status," David explained, carefully collecting samples for later analysis. "Fresh scat indicates recent feeding activity in this immediate area." Rebecca monitored communications equipment and conducted medical supply inventory, ensuring all emergency protocols remained operational. Satellite phone signal remains strong. Emergency beacon status shows full battery charge and GPS lock. The morning's first bear sighting occurred at approximately 8:30 a.m. when a medium-sized brown bear emerged from the forest on the opposite bank of the creek. Marcus immediately began photographing, using his telephoto lens to capture detailed images while maintaining safe distance. "Female, probably 4 to 5 years old," Sarah assessed through binoculars. "No cubs visible, which means she's likely solitary." The bear demonstrated classic fishing behavior, standing motionless in shallow water before striking with lightning speed to catch salmon attempting to navigate upstream rapids. Her success rate appeared remarkably high. Nearly 70% of her strikes resulted in captured fish. "This is exactly the behavior I need to document," David noted, recording detailed observations of hunting techniques, feeding duration, and environmental factors affecting success rates. The female bear fed steadily for nearly 3 hours, consuming an estimated 15 to 18 salmon before retreating into the forest. Her departure coincided with the arrival of a much larger bear, clearly a dominant male, whose presence immediately altered the dynamics of the fishing area. "Territory establishment in action," Sarah observed. The female yielded prime fishing spots to avoid confrontation with the larger male. The male bear, standing nearly 9 feet tall when upright, demonstrated even more impressive fishing skills. His massive paws could pin struggling salmon against the creek bottom with devastating efficiency, and his feeding rate exceeded anything the team had previously observed. Marcus captured hundreds of images, documenting every aspect of the bear's hunting behavior. "The power and precision are incredible," he said, adjusting camera settings for changing light conditions. "These images will be portfolio centerpieces." Throughout the morning, Additional bears appeared intermittently, creating a complex social dynamic around the prime fishing locations. Smaller bears waited patiently for opportunities to fish in less optimal spots, while the dominant male controlled the most productive pools. Classic hierarchical behavior, Sarah noted. Size and aggression determine access to the best feeding opportunities. By midday, bear activity decreased significantly as the animals retreated to shaded areas for rest and digestion. The research team used this lull to reposition cameras, collect additional data samples, and analyze the morning's observations. Preliminary data suggests this location supports exceptional bear density, David reported, reviewing his field notes. We've documented 6 individual bears in a single morning. Thomas maintained constant vigilance regarding camp security and team safety. High bear density increases encounter probability. Everyone stays alert and follows safety protocols without exception. The afternoon brought new challenges as weather conditions began changing. Cloud cover increased and wind patterns shifted, bringing cooler temperatures and the smell of possible precipitation. Weather system approaching from the southwest, Rebecca announced, monitoring satellite weather data. Possible rain tonight, clearing tomorrow morning. Rain in bear country presented additional complications, reduced visibility, altered scent conditions, and potential changes in bear behavior patterns. Thomas reviewed contingency plans for continuing research activities during inclement weather. If conditions deteriorate significantly, we consolidate at base camp until weather improves, he decided. Safety takes precedence over research objectives. Evening brought another period of intense bear activity as animals returned to the creek for evening feeding. Marcus positioned himself at a predetermined photography location using natural terrain features for concealment while maintaining safe distances from bear travel routes. The evening's highlight occurred when 2 subadult males engaged in a brief but dramatic confrontation over fishing rights to a particularly productive pool. The larger of the 2 bears established dominance through aggressive posturing and vocalizations, forcing the smaller bear to seek alternative fishing locations. Incredible behavioral documentation, Sarah recorded, noting the specific dominance behaviors and submission signals. This kind of interaction rarely gets observed, much less photographed. Marcus captured the entire sequence, his camera's motor drive recording multiple frames per second as the bears faced off. The raw power and intensity of the confrontation provided a stark reminder of the forces they were observing. As the second day concluded, the team gathered for evening debriefing and planning for tomorrow's activities. The initial research results exceeded all expectations, but everyone understood they were still in the early stages of what would be a complex and potentially dangerous expedition. Tomorrow, we expand our observation range, Sarah announced, consulting topographical maps. There are additional fishing areas upstream that should support different bear populations. The night passed without major incidents, though periodic sounds of bear activity around the creek continued to remind everyone of their proximity to one of nature's most formidable predators. Marcus found himself waking several times, listening intently to forest sounds and reflexively checking the location of his bear spray. Day 3 dawned overcast with light drizzle, creating challenging photography conditions but providing new opportunities to observe bear behavior during different weather patterns. The reduced visibility required more cautious movement and heightened awareness of potential close encounters. Visibility limited to about 50 yards in this drizzle, Thomas observed, checking his GPS coordinates. We adjust movement patterns accordingly and maintain closer team spacing. Despite weather challenges, bear activity remained high as animals continued intensive feeding to build fat reserves for winter hibernation. The research team documented hunting behaviors they hadn't observed in clear weather. bears using sound rather than sight to locate salmon, and fishing techniques adapted to low visibility conditions. Fascinating adaptation, Sarah noted, watching a large male bear fishing effectively despite limited visibility. They're relying heavily on hearing and water vibrations to locate fish. Marcus discovered that overcast conditions actually enhanced certain photographic opportunities, creating dramatic lighting effects and allowing closer approach distances due to reduced bear awareness of human presence. The morning's most significant event occurred when the team encountered fresh tracks of an exceptionally large bear, paw prints measuring nearly 14 inches long, suggesting an animal potentially weighing over 1,500 pounds. "These are the largest brown bear tracks I've ever documented," Thomas admitted, measuring and photographing the clear impressions. "This animal would be among the biggest bears in North America." The tracks appeared less than 6 hours old, indicating the massive bear had passed through their immediate area during the pre-dawn hours. The implications were sobering. An animal of this size could present serious danger if encountered at close range. "We need to modify our movement patterns," Thomas decided. "An animal this large deserves extra respect and caution." David placed additional trail cameras along the track pattern, hoping to document the massive bear's movements and behavior. "If we can get footage of this animal, it would represent a significant research achievement." The afternoon brought a brief clearing in weather conditions, providing excellent visibility for continued observations. Bear activity increased dramatically as improved conditions allowed more efficient fishing, and the team documented some of their most productive data collection yet. 6 different bears fishing simultaneously, Sarah counted, scanning the creek through binoculars. This concentration represents extraordinary population density. Marcus worked frantically to capture images of multiple bears sharing fishing areas, a relatively rare behavior that demonstrated the exceptional abundance of salmon in this particular creek system. Evening approached with clearing skies and dropping temperatures, creating optimal conditions for what would become their most memorable wildlife encounter. As the team prepared for evening observations, none of them anticipated the events that would unfold over the next several hours. The massive bear, whose tracks they'd discovered earlier, emerged from the forest at approximately 6:15 p.m., and his appearance immediately changed the entire dynamic of the creek area. Standing nearly 10 feet tall when upright, the enormous male represented the apex of brown bear evolution, a predator whose size and power commanded absolute respect from every other animal in the area. "Incredible," Marcus breathed, focusing his telephoto lens on the giant bear. "This animal is absolutely magnificent." All other bears immediately yielded prime fishing locations to the dominant male, creating a clear demonstration of natural hierarchy. The massive bear moved with surprising grace for his size, each step calculated and purposeful as he approached the creek. Sarah watched in fascination as the giant bear demonstrated fishing techniques that exceeded anything in the scientific literature. His massive paws could pin multiple salmon simultaneously, and his feeding efficiency suggested decades of experience in these waters. "This animal represents the pinnacle of brown bear development," she observed, recording detailed behavioral notes. Size, fishing skill, and territorial dominance all at maximum levels. The photography opportunities were unprecedented, but Marcus remained acutely aware of the inherent dangers. Even at their safe distance of over 200 yards, the bear's size and power created an intimidating presence that affected everyone's behavior. "Safety distances may need adjustment," Thomas observed quietly. "Traditional guidelines assume average-sized bears. This animal operates by different rules." For nearly 2 hours, the team documented the massive bear's fishing activities, capturing scientific data and photographic images that would define their expedition's success. The bear's presence seemed to affect the entire ecosystem. Other wildlife became more cautious, and even the sounds of the forest seemed muted. As twilight approached, the giant bear concluded his fishing session and began moving upstream along the creek bank. His path would take him closer to the research team's position, requiring careful positioning to maintain safe distances. "He's moving toward our sector," Thomas noted, tracking the bear's progress through binoculars. "We need to be prepared to relocate if necessary." The bear's approach route followed the creek bank directly toward their observation position, creating both incredible documentation opportunities and heightened safety concerns. Marcus continued photographing as long as safe distances could be maintained, but everyone prepared for potential withdrawal to base camp. At approximately 8:30 p.m., the massive bear passed within 150 yards of their position, closer than any bear encounter they'd experienced during the expedition. The animal's size and power were overwhelming at this distance, and his awareness of human presence became clearly apparent. "He knows we're here," Sarah whispered, watching the bear's body language through binoculars. "See how his ears are tracking our position?" The bear paused in his movement, standing upright to better assess the human presence. For nearly 30 seconds, predator and researchers studied each other across the wilderness landscape. The moment represented the intersection of two worlds, scientific observation and primordial predatory instinct. Marcus captured the entire encounter, his telephoto lens bringing the massive bear's features into sharp detail. The animal's eyes, intelligent and calculating, seemed to evaluate the potential threat represented by human presence in his territory. Eventually, the bear dropped to all fours and continued upstream, apparently deciding the research team posed no immediate threat to his activities. His departure left everyone slightly shaken but exhilarated by the close encounter with one of nature's most impressive predators. "Absolutely incredible," David recorded in his field notes. "Close encounter with dominant male brown bear, estimated weight 1,500 plus pounds. Duration of visual contact approximately 3 minutes. Bear aware of human presence but showed no aggressive behavior." The encounter provided perfect material for evening discussion as the team gathered around their camp stove for dinner. Everyone understood they'd witnessed something exceptional, a close interaction with a truly massive brown bear that had proceeded without incident due to proper protocols and mutual respect. "That animal could be 25 years old or more," Sarah estimated, based on the bear's size and apparent experience. To reach that size in this environment requires exceptional hunting skills and territorial dominance. Thomas reviewed safety protocols in light of the day's events. "Encounters like today remind us why we maintain strict distance guidelines and carry emergency equipment. That bear could have covered the distance between us in less than 10 seconds if he'd chosen to charge." The night passed peacefully, but everyone remained more alert after the close encounter with the massive bear. Morning sounds from the creek suggested continued bear activity, and the team prepared for another day of intensive research and documentation. Day 4 brought perfect weather conditions, clear skies, calm winds, and excellent visibility. Marcus prepared his camera equipment for what he hoped would be optimal photography conditions, while Sarah organized data collection protocols for expanded research activities. "Today we document feeding behavior at the upper fishing areas," she announced, consulting detailed maps of the creek system. "Different habitat characteristics should support different hunting strategies." The morning hike upstream revealed additional signs of the massive bear's presence. More fresh tracks, feeding sites with partially consumed salmon, and territorial markings on trees. The giant bear clearly controlled significant territory along the entire creek system. "Territorial range appears extensive," David noted, measuring claw marks on tree bark. These markings are 8 feet above ground level, indicating an animal of exceptional size. The upper fishing areas proved even more productive than their base camp location, with deeper pools and faster current creating ideal salmon habitat. Bear activity was immediately apparent, with multiple animals working different sections of the creek simultaneously. Marcus positioned himself for optimal photography, using natural terrain features to maintain concealment while documenting bear behavior. The morning's first major subject was a large female with 2 cubs, a family group that represented both excellent photographic opportunities and heightened safety concerns. Female with cubs requires extreme caution, Thomas reminded everyone. Protective maternal instincts make this the most dangerous bear encounter scenario. The mother bear demonstrated extraordinary fishing skills while simultaneously maintaining constant vigilance for potential threats to her cubs. Her ability to multitask, hunting for food while protecting offspring, provided fascinating insights into brown bear maternal behavior. Sarah documented the complex social dynamics as the female bear navigated interactions with other bears while protecting her cubs. Subordinate bears give extra distance to females with young, she observed. Even large males avoid confrontation with protective mothers. The cubs, approximately 18 months old, were beginning to learn fishing techniques through observation and imitation. Their clumsy attempts at catching salmon provided entertaining moments, but also demonstrated the long learning process required to master survival skills. Marcus captured hundreds of images of the family group, documenting maternal behavior, cub development, and fishing instruction techniques. These behavioral images are exactly what National Geographic wants, he noted, reviewing images on his camera's display screen. Midday brought the arrival of their massive bear from the previous evening, and his presence immediately altered the behavior of every other animal in the area. The female with cubs retreated to a safe distance, while other bears yielded prime fishing locations to avoid confrontation. Dominance hierarchy in action, Sarah recorded, watching the behavioral changes triggered by the massive male's arrival. His presence alone restructures the entire social dynamic. The giant bear's fishing performance exceeded previous observations, demonstrating techniques and efficiency that seemed almost supernatural. His success rate approached 90%, and his consumption rate suggested an animal preparing for extended hibernation. Hyperphagic feeding behavior, David noted, using scientific terminology for the intensive eating that precedes winter hibernation. This animal could be consuming 40 to 50 pounds of salmon daily. Afternoon observations focused on territorial interactions between different bears as they competed for access to prime fishing locations. The research team documented several confrontations, ranging from subtle posturing to dramatic face-offs that demonstrated the serious nature of resource competition. Resource competition intensifies as salmon run begins declining, Sarah explained, noting changes in bear behavior patterns. Access to remaining prime fishing opportunities becomes increasingly valuable. Marcus captured a sequence of images showing 2 large males engaged in a territorial dispute over a particularly productive fishing pool. The confrontation involved aggressive vocalizations, posturing, and brief physical contact before the subordinate bear yielded position. These behavioral documentation photos are unprecedented, he observed, reviewing the dramatic sequence. Most bear confrontations happen too quickly or at too great a distance for detailed photography. Evening brought another visit from the massive dominant male, but this time his behavior seemed different, more restless and territorial. He spent considerable time marking trees and investigating scents, suggesting heightened awareness of potential challenges to his dominance. Increased territorial behavior, Thomas noted, observing the bear's actions through binoculars. Something has changed in the local dynamics. The change became apparent when a second exceptionally large male bear emerged from the forest approximately 400 yards upstream. This new arrival appeared nearly as massive as their familiar giant, suggesting a potential challenge to the established territorial hierarchy. Two alpha males in the same drainage, Sarah breathed, recognizing the significance of the situation. This could lead to a major confrontation. The arrival of the second massive bear created immediate tension throughout the creek area. Smaller bears quickly vacated the vicinity, apparently sensing the potential for serious conflict between two apex predators competing for territorial dominance. Marcus prepared his camera equipment for what could be an extraordinary documentation opportunity, but Thomas emphasized the serious safety implications of having two giant bears in close proximity. Two animals of this size engaged in territorial conflict represents extreme danger, he warned. We need to be prepared for immediate withdrawal if the situation escalates. The two massive bears maintained distance from each other initially, each working separate sections of the creek while clearly aware of the other's presence. The tension was palpable, as both animals demonstrated fishing behaviors while simultaneously monitoring potential competition. Classic territorial assessment, Sarah observed, noting the subtle behavioral cues each bear displayed. They're evaluating each other's size, condition, and determination before committing to direct confrontation. The evening proceeded without direct conflict, but the presence of two alpha males fundamentally changed the ecosystem dynamics. Other bears remained scarce. Salmon seemed more skittish, and even bird activity decreased in response to predatory tension. As night approached, both massive bears retreated to separate areas of the forest, but everyone understood that resolution of territorial competition remained pending. The potential for serious conflict between two apex predators created an underlying tension that affected the entire research team. Tomorrow could bring the confrontation we've been anticipating, Thomas observed during evening debriefing. Two animals of this caliber won't share territory indefinitely. The night passed with frequent sounds of large animal movement, suggesting both bears remained active in the area. Marcus found sleep difficult, knowing that extraordinary documentation opportunities might be developing while safety concerns reached their highest levels of the expedition. Day 5 dawned with heavy overcast skies and intermittent drizzle, creating challenging visibility conditions that added complexity to an already tense situation. The research team prepared for what could be their most significant day of wildlife observation while maintaining heightened awareness of safety protocols. Weather conditions increase encounter risks, Thomas announced, checking GPS coordinates and visibility ranges. Reduced sight lines mean shorter reaction times for emergency procedures. Morning observations revealed that both massive bears remained in the immediate area, with fresh tracks indicating they'd moved closer together during the night. The territorial competition appeared to be escalating toward inevitable confrontation. Track patterns suggest territorial boundary establishment, Sarah analyzed, studying paw print locations and movement patterns. Both bears are marking territory more aggressively. David placed additional trail cameras to document potential confrontations, programming motion sensors for maximum sensitivity to capture any interactions between the competing males. The morning's first bear sighting occurred at 7:45 a.m., when their familiar giant emerged from the forest and immediately began aggressive territorial marking behaviors. He rubbed against trees, left scent marks, and vocalized in ways the team hadn't previously observed. Heightened territorial assertion, Sarah recorded, noting the dramatic changes in the bear's behavior patterns. This animal is preparing for serious competition. Marcus documented the aggressive posturing with his telephoto lens, capturing images that showed the bear's massive size and intimidating presence. The animal's demeanor had shifted from casual dominance to active territorial defense. At approximately 8:20 a.m., the second massive male appeared upstream, and his presence immediately triggered escalated behavior from the established dominant bear. Both animals began moving toward each other along the creek bank, their intentions clearly focused on territorial resolution. "Here we go," Thomas said quietly, ensuring everyone's emergency equipment remained readily accessible. "This is what we've been anticipating." The two massive bears approached each other with deliberate movements, each animal displaying classic territorial challenge behaviors. Standing upright repeatedly, they assessed each other's size and condition while advancing toward inevitable confrontation. Marcus worked frantically to document the approaching conflict, understanding that such encounters between apex predators rarely occurred where human observers could safely witness them. His telephoto lens captured every detail of the behavioral displays preceding actual combat. "Size differential appears minimal," Sarah observed through binoculars. "Both animals are exceptional examples of brown bear development." The bears closed to within 50 yards of each other before the first direct confrontation occurred. Aggressive vocalizations echoed across the wilderness as both animals reared to full height, displaying their massive size and power. What followed was the most dramatic wildlife encounter any team member had ever witnessed. The two giant bears engaged in a territorial battle that demonstrated the raw power and ferocity of apex predators defending critical resources. The initial contact involved aggressive pawing and grappling as each bear attempted to establish physical dominance. Their massive size created thunderous impacts as they collided, and their vocalizations carried across the wilderness for miles. Marcus captured the entire sequence, his camera's motor drive recording multiple frames per second as the two titans battled for territorial supremacy. The power and intensity exceeded anything in wildlife literature, providing unprecedented documentation of apex predator conflict. "Incredible," Sarah breathed, recording detailed behavioral observations while maintaining awareness of safety distances. "This represents the ultimate expression of brown bear territorial behavior." The confrontation continued for nearly 20 minutes, with both bears demonstrating remarkable stamina and determination. Neither animal showed signs of backing down, suggesting this territorial dispute involved critical resources worth serious risk. Thomas monitored the conflict while maintaining constant awareness of team safety, prepared to implement emergency withdrawal procedures if the fighting bears moved closer to their observation position. The resolution came suddenly when the challenger sustained what appeared to be a significant injury to his left shoulder, causing him to break off engagement and retreat toward the forest. The established dominant male pursued briefly before returning to claim territorial victory. "Territorial dominance re-established," Sarah recorded, watching the victorious bear resume normal fishing behavior while the defeated challenger disappeared into the wilderness. Natural selection in action. Marcus had documented the entire encounter, capturing images that would define wildlife photography standards for territorial conflict between apex predators. The dramatic sequence represented the culmination of their expedition's documentation objectives. "These images are unprecedented," he observed, reviewing the combat sequence on his camera's display. "No photographer has ever captured this level of detail during a confrontation between bears of this size." The aftermath of the territorial battle left the area temporarily quiet as other wildlife waited for environmental tensions to subside. The victorious bear resumed fishing activities, but his heightened alertness suggested continued awareness of potential challenges. "Ecosystem dynamics will gradually return to normal," Sarah explained, noting how the territorial resolution affected other animals in the area. "But the dominant male will remain more vigilant for several days." Afternoon observations confirmed that normal bear activity patterns were slowly resuming as word of the territorial resolution spread through environmental cues and behavioral signals. Smaller bears began returning to fishing areas, though they maintained respectful distances from the proven dominant male. The research team spent the remainder of the day documenting post-conflict behaviors and analyzing the territorial battle's impact on local ecosystem dynamics. The data represented groundbreaking research on apex predator territorial competition. This morning's observations provide material for multiple scientific publications, David noted, reviewing extensive behavioral data collected during the confrontation. Territorial conflict of this intensity has never been documented in such detail. Evening brought a sense of completion to their research objectives, as the team had successfully documented exceptional bear behavior under natural conditions. The territorial battle represented the apex of their expedition goals, providing both scientific data and photographic documentation of unprecedented quality. "Mission accomplished," Thomas declared during evening debriefing. "We've documented bear behavior that exceeds our most optimistic expectations." As night settled over the wilderness, the team reflected on their extraordinary experiences, observing some of North America's most impressive predators. The combination of scientific research, wildlife photography, and survival adventure had created memories that would last lifetimes. "This expedition will define my career," Marcus admitted, reviewing hundreds of exceptional wildlife images captured during their time in bear country. These photographs represent the pinnacle of wildlife documentation. Sarah organized research data that would contribute to scientific understanding of brown bear behavior, territorial dynamics, and ecological relationships. The expedition had exceeded all research objectives, while providing entirely new insights into apex predator behavior. The night passed peacefully, with normal forest sounds indicating that ecosystem tensions had largely subsided following the morning's territorial resolution. The team prepared for their final days of research, understanding that they'd already achieved extraordinary success. Day 6 brought clear weather and renewed opportunities for documenting post-conflict bear behavior patterns. The established dominant male continued his fishing activities with increased confidence, while other bears gradually resumed normal activities at respectful distances. Marcus focused on capturing images that told the complete story of their expedition, landscape photography that established environmental context, detailed wildlife portraits, and behavioral documentation that revealed the complex social dynamics of brown bear populations. "These final images complete the narrative," he explained, photographing the massive dominant bear fishing in morning light. From arrival through territorial conflict to resolution, a complete documentation of bear behavior in pristine wilderness. Sarah and David collaborated on final data collection, ensuring their research documentation would support multiple scientific publications and contribute to conservation efforts for brown bear populations across North America. "Data quality exceeds professional standards," David observed, reviewing comprehensive behavioral observations collected throughout the expedition. "This research will influence brown bear management policies for decades." The morning's observations revealed that the injured challenger bear had not returned to the immediate area, suggesting the territorial dispute had been decisively resolved. The victorious male now controlled premium fishing resources without competition from other apex predators. "Territorial stability re-established," Sarah noted, documenting the behavioral evidence of successful dominance assertion. The dominant male can now focus entirely on hyperphagic feeding before hibernation. Afternoon activities included equipment maintenance, data organization, and preparation for the expedition's conclusion. Everyone understood that their time in this pristine wilderness was drawing to a close, making final observations particularly precious. "Last chance for miracle shots," Marcus observed, positioning himself for optimal evening photography conditions. Every remaining moment represents irreplaceable opportunities. The evening's highlight occurred when the massive dominant bear brought down a particularly large salmon, a chinook that appeared to weigh nearly 40 pounds. The successful catch demonstrated the fishing skills that had established his territorial dominance. Perfect hunting technique, Sarah recorded, watching the bear's efficient processing of the large salmon. Experience and size combined to create maximum hunting effectiveness. Marcus captured the feeding sequence in detail, documenting how apex predators processed large prey items and the nutritional strategies that supported their massive size requirements. Day 7 represented their final full day of research activities before beginning expedition conclusion procedures. Weather conditions remained optimal, providing excellent opportunities for final documentation and data collection. Comprehensive success, Thomas declared, reviewing expedition objectives against actual achievements. Every research goal exceeded, safety protocols maintained throughout, and exceptional wildlife encounters documented. The morning brought one last visit from their massive bear subject, who had become the expedition's primary focus. His fishing performance remained exceptional, and his territorial confidence suggested complete dominance over the creek system. Final behavioral observations, Sarah recorded, noting the bear's relaxed demeanor and efficient hunting patterns. Territorial dominance allows focus on feeding rather than competitive monitoring. Marcus used his remaining memory storage to capture final images of their primary subject, understanding that these photographs would become the defining images of his career in wildlife photography. Career-defining expedition, he reflected, watching the massive bear through his telephoto lens. These images will represent the pinnacle of brown bear photography. Afternoon activities focused on equipment packing, camp cleanup, and preparation for extraction. The research team methodically organized scientific data, photographic equipment, and personal gear for efficient departure procedures. Leave no trace protocols in effect, Thomas reminded everyone, ensuring their wilderness camp would show no evidence of human presence after their departure. This pristine environment must remain unchanged for future wildlife. Evening brought final observations of bear activity, with multiple animals visible fishing in the creek system. The ecosystem had returned to natural patterns following the territorial disruption, demonstrating the resilience of wilderness environments. Ecosystem recovery complete, Sarah noted, observing normal bear behavioral patterns throughout the fishing areas. Natural balance restored following territorial resolution. The team gathered for final evening in bear country, sharing stories and reflections on their extraordinary experiences. Everyone understood they'd participated in exceptional wildlife encounters that few humans would ever witness. Life-changing expedition, David summarized, reviewing comprehensive research data collected during their time in the wilderness. This experience will influence my entire career in wildlife biology. Marcus reviewed his photographic achievements, selecting images that would define the expedition's legacy. The territorial conflict documentation represented unprecedented wildlife photography that would set new standards for predator behavior documentation. These images will be displayed in natural history museums worldwide, he predicted, examining the dramatic sequence of territorial combat between apex predators. No photographer has ever captured this level of detail during such encounters. The night passed quietly as team members prepared mentally for return to civilization. Their time in pristine wilderness had provided profound experiences that would influence their perspectives for years to come. Day 8 arrived with overcast skies and increasing wind, suggesting weather changes that could affect extraction procedures. Jake Morrison's scheduled pickup remained confirmed, but deteriorating conditions added uncertainty to departure timing. "Weather monitoring critical," Rebecca announced, checking satellite forecasts and communication protocols. "Pilot discretion will determine actual extraction timing based on flight safety considerations." The morning's activities focused on final equipment packing and camp breakdown, ensuring everything was prepared for efficient departure when aircraft arrival became confirmed. The team worked systematically to erase all evidence of their presence. "Complete restoration required," Thomas directed, supervising camp cleanup procedures. This location must remain pristine for continued wildlife use. Final bear observations revealed continued normal activity patterns, with multiple animals fishing successfully throughout the creek system. The massive dominant male maintained his territorial control, while other bears respected established boundaries. "Stable ecosystem dynamics," Sarah recorded in final research notes. "Bear population healthy, territorial hierarchies established, and environmental conditions optimal for continued wildlife success." Marcus completed final photography sessions, capturing landscape images that would provide context for wildlife portraits taken throughout the expedition. The combination of environmental and behavioral documentation created comprehensive visual narratives. "Complete photographic story," he assessed, reviewing image sequences that documented their entire expedition experience, from arrival through territorial conflict to ecosystem recovery, a complete wildlife documentary in photographs. At 11:30 a.m., the distant sound of aircraft engines indicated Jake Morrison's approach for extraction procedures. The familiar sound of their charter plane represented return to civilization after 8 days of total wilderness immersion. "Extraction confirmed," Rebecca announced, monitoring radio communications with their pilot. "Aircraft on final approach to landing strip." The team completed final equipment checks and gathered at the designated pickup coordinates, watching their bush plane approach the remote gravel airstrip. Everyone felt mixed emotions, satisfaction at expedition success combined with reluctance to leave pristine wilderness. Jake Morrison executed a perfect landing despite challenging wind conditions, demonstrating the professional skills that made wilderness extraction possible. His aircraft represented the critical link between remote research locations and civilization. "Perfect timing," Jake called out as the team approached his plane with expedition gear. "Weather window closing rapidly. We need immediate departure for safe return flight." Equipment loading proceeded efficiently as everyone understood the importance of rapid departure before weather conditions deteriorated further. Scientific gear, photographic equipment, and personal items were secured for the return flight to civilization. "Expedition complete," Thomas announced as the team boarded their aircraft. "Objectives achieved, safety maintained, and exceptional wildlife experiences documented." As the plane lifted off from the remote airstrip, team members looked down at the pristine wilderness that had provided extraordinary experiences. The landscape appeared unchanged by their presence, exactly as required by wilderness ethics. "Incredible expedition," Sarah reflected, watching the creek system disappear below them. "This research will influence brown bear studies for decades." Marcus secured his camera equipment for the flight, understanding that his memory cards contained some of the most important wildlife images ever captured. The territorial conflict documentation would define professional wildlife photography standards. "Career achievement unlocked," he smiled, anticipating the reception his photographs would receive from National Geographic editors and wildlife photography communities worldwide. The return flight provided opportunities for team members to process their experiences and begin planning how expedition results would be shared with scientific and conservation communities. Their documentation could influence wildlife management policies across North America. Conservation implications significant, David noted, reviewing research data that demonstrated healthy brown bear populations in pristine wilderness areas. This data supports continued habitat protection efforts. Jake Morrison navigated challenging weather conditions during the return flight, demonstrating professional piloting skills that ensured safe return to civilization. His experience with Alaska wilderness flying made dangerous extraction procedures routine. Weather deteriorating rapidly, he announced, adjusting flight path to avoid developing storm systems. Extraction timing was critical for safety. The familiar sight of Anchorage approaching marked the conclusion of their wilderness expedition and return to civilization. Everyone felt the psychological transition from survival mode back to conventional urban environments. Reality returning, Rebecca observed, seeing urban development appear below them. 8 days feels like months when completely immersed in wilderness. Landing procedures at Anchorage International Airport represented the official conclusion of their expedition, but everyone understood that processing their experiences would continue for months or years. The wilderness had fundamentally changed their perspectives on nature and survival. "Expedition success complete," Thomas declared as they disembarked from their charter aircraft. "Every objective achieved safely with exceptional results." The immediate post-expedition period involved equipment retrieval, data backup procedures, and initial result sharing with sponsoring organizations. Marcus uploaded selected images to National Geographic servers, while Sarah began preliminary research report preparation. Initial results exceed expectations, Sarah reported to university administrators via satellite phone. Research data supports multiple publication opportunities and significant conservation implications. Marcus contacted National Geographic editors to preview expedition photography results, generating immediate excitement about territorial conflict documentation and apex predator behavioral images. "Unprecedented wildlife photography," his editor responded after reviewing initial image selections. "These photographs will anchor major wildlife features and influence conservation awareness worldwide." Hotel accommodations in Anchorage provided opportunities for team members to process their wilderness experiences while beginning the transition back to conventional civilization. Everyone required adjustment time after total wilderness immersion. "Psychological adjustment necessary," Rebecca noted, observing how wilderness experiences affected team members' perspectives on urban environments and conventional lifestyle patterns. David began organizing research data for scientific publication, understanding that his expedition results would contribute to doctoral dissertation completion and influence his career in wildlife biology. "Dissertation material secured," he reported to academic advisors. "Expedition data provides foundation for multiple research publications and significant contributions to brown bear behavioral understanding." The first week following expedition conclusion involved intensive data processing, image editing, and preliminary result sharing with scientific and conservation communities. Everyone worked to ensure expedition achievements received appropriate recognition and application. Marcus spent long hours in digital darkrooms, processing hundreds of wildlife images and selecting the most impactful photographs for National Geographic publication. The territorial conflict sequence required careful editing to maintain dramatic impact while ensuring scientific accuracy. "Image processing marathon," he explained, working 16-hour days to meet publication deadlines. "These photographs will define wildlife photography standards for territorial conflict documentation." Sarah collaborated with research colleagues to analyze behavioral data and begin scientific publication preparation. The expedition results provided material for multiple research papers addressing different aspects of brown bear ecology and behavior. Publication pipeline established, she reported, outlining research papers addressing territorial behavior, feeding efficiency, ecosystem dynamics, and conservation implications of expedition findings. David worked with university statisticians to analyze research data and ensure scientific validity of behavioral observations. His dissertation committee expressed enthusiasm about expedition results and their potential impact on wildlife biology fields. Academic Career Foundation established, his advisor confirmed, reviewing preliminary research analyses. Expedition data provides exceptional doctoral dissertation material with significant publication potential. Thomas began planning future expedition opportunities, understanding that their success would generate interest in additional wilderness research projects. His guiding expertise had been crucial to expedition safety and success. Future expeditions confirmed, he announced, discussing potential research projects with academic and conservation organizations. Demand for wilderness research support exceeds available scheduling. The one-month post-expedition period brought significant recognition for expedition achievements. Marcus's photographs appeared in National Geographic's annual wildlife photography issue, generating international attention for brown bear conservation. Global recognition achieved, he reported, tracking worldwide media coverage of expedition photography. Conservation awareness significantly enhanced through visual documentation of apex predator behavior. Sarah's preliminary research findings were accepted for presentation at the International Conference on Bear Research and Management, providing professional recognition for expedition scientific achievements. Professional recognition confirmed, she announced, receiving conference presentation acceptance. Expedition research contributes significantly to scientific understanding of brown bear territorial behavior. David's research data supported successful doctoral dissertation defense, establishing his academic career foundation and positioning him for continued research in wildlife biology. Academic achievement unlocked, he celebrated, completing dissertation requirements ahead of schedule. Expedition success directly contributed to doctoral program completion. The 3-month post-expedition period brought continued recognition and application of expedition results. Conservation organizations used expedition documentation to support habitat protection initiatives across brown bear ranges. Conservation impact realized, environmental groups reported, using expedition photography and research data in habitat protection campaigns. Public awareness significantly enhanced through expedition documentation. Scientific publications began appearing in peer-reviewed journals, ensuring expedition research results would influence wildlife biology and conservation for decades. The territorial conflict documentation provided unprecedented insights into apex predator behavior. Scientific legacy established, journal editors confirmed, accepting multiple research publications based on expedition findings. Expedition research advances scientific understanding of brown bear ecology and behavior. Marcus's wildlife photography career reached new heights as expedition images received international awards and recognition. His territorial conflict documentation became the standard reference for wildlife photography excellence. Photography career pinnacle achieved, professional organizations acknowledged, presenting multiple awards for expedition wildlife photography. Territorial conflict images represent unprecedented wildlife documentation achievements. The 6-month post-expedition period brought continued applications of expedition results in conservation, education, and scientific research. Universities used expedition documentation in wildlife biology curricula, ensuring future generations would benefit from expedition achievements. Educational impact realized, academic administrators reported, incorporating expedition materials into multiple university courses. Student engagement significantly enhanced through expedition documentation. Research data continued generating scientific publications and conservation applications, with expedition findings influencing wildlife management policies across North America. The comprehensive behavioral documentation provided foundational material for future research. Policy influence confirmed, wildlife management agencies acknowledged, incorporating expedition findings into brown bear conservation strategies. Research data directly influences habitat protection and wildlife management decisions. Thomas's wilderness guiding business expanded significantly as expedition success generated demand for similar research support. His expertise became sought after by scientific and conservation organizations worldwide. Business success realized, he reported, booking expedition support contracts months in advance. Expedition achievement demonstrates wilderness research capabilities and safety expertise. The one-year post-expedition anniversary brought reflection on long-term impacts of their wilderness research. Every team member's career had been fundamentally influenced by expedition experiences and achievements. Life-changing expedition confirmed, participants reflected, gathering for anniversary celebration. Wilderness experiences continue influencing personal and professional development. Marcus had established himself as the world's leading wildlife photographer, specializing in apex predator behavior, with expedition images continuing to generate recognition and conservation awareness worldwide. International recognition sustained, he reported, tracking continued media coverage and conservation applications of expedition photography. Wildlife documentation continues influencing conservation awareness globally. Sarah's research career flourished as expedition findings continued generating scientific publications and conference presentations. Her expertise in brown bear behavior became internationally recognized through expedition achievements. Scientific career established, she confirmed, receiving tenure-track position offers from multiple universities. Expedition research provides career foundation and continued research opportunities. David completed his doctoral program and accepted a research position with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, where his expedition experience directly contributed to state wildlife management programs. Professional career launched, he announced, beginning work on brown bear population studies informed by expedition research. Wilderness experience provides practical foundation for conservation work. Thomas continued expanding his wilderness guiding business while supporting additional research expeditions throughout Alaska and northern Canada. His safety expertise became legendary among wilderness research communities. Professional legacy established, he reflected, reviewing continued success in wilderness expedition support. Safety expertise and expedition success create lasting professional reputation. Rebecca leveraged expedition medical experience to specialize in wilderness emergency medicine, eventually establishing training programs for medical professionals working in remote locations. Medical career direction established, she reported, developing wilderness medicine curricula based partly on expedition experiences. Remote medical expertise applied to professional training programs. The expedition's legacy continued growing as documentation and research results influenced conservation awareness, scientific understanding, and wilderness protection efforts across North America. Their 8 days in pristine bear country had generated impacts lasting far beyond the wilderness experience itself. Conservation legacy confirmed, environmental organizations reported, tracking continued applications of expedition results in habitat protection and public awareness campaigns. Expedition documentation continues supporting brown bear conservation efforts. The massive brown bear they documented continued ruling his territorial domain, unaware that his behavior had been captured in images and research data influencing conservation efforts worldwide. His unconscious contribution to scientific understanding and conservation awareness represented the ultimate success of their wilderness expedition. In remote Alaskan wilderness, the creek continued flowing through pristine forest. Salmon continued their annual spawning migrations, and brown bears continued their ancient patterns of territorial dominance and seasonal feeding. The natural cycles remained unchanged, exactly as they should in true wilderness. The expedition had achieved perfect success, comprehensive documentation of apex predator behavior, while leaving pristine wilderness completely unchanged. Their legacy lived on in scientific publications, conservation awareness, and photographic documentation that would influence understanding of brown bears for generations to come. Years later, team members would still gather annually to commemorate their expedition and reflect on its continuing impacts. The wilderness had fundamentally changed their perspectives on nature, survival, and conservation, creating bonds and memories that would last lifetimes. Ultimate expedition achievement, they agreed, understanding that their 8 days in bear country represented the pinnacle of wilderness research and documentation. Their legacy would continue influencing conservation and scientific understanding long after they were gone. The last hunt had concluded, but its impacts would continue forever, ensuring that pristine wilderness and magnificent apex predators would receive the protection and respect they deserved. Their documentation had created a permanent bridge between wilderness reality and conservation awareness, exactly as they had hoped when entering bear country months earlier. In the end, they had achieved something remarkable: comprehensive scientific and photographic documentation of apex predator behavior while maintaining absolute respect for wilderness integrity. The massive bears continued their ancient patterns unchanged, while human understanding of their magnificent lives had been forever enhanced through dedicated research and exceptional documentation. The expedition represented everything wilderness research should be: respectful observation that enhanced scientific understanding while preserving pristine natural environments for future generations. Their legacy would continue influencing conservation awareness and scientific research for decades to come, ensuring the magnificent brown bears of Alaska would receive appropriate protection and respect. Their story demonstrated that humans could enter pristine wilderness, conduct meaningful research, and return to civilization, having left absolutely no trace of their presence while bringing back documentation that would influence conservation efforts worldwide. The last hunt had achieved perfect balance between scientific advancement and wilderness preservation, creating a model for future research expeditions in the world's remaining pristine environments. The next stories: Kodiak Bear, Malls. 3 police officers responding to call. January 29, 2025. The radio crackled to life at 11:47 p.m. on January 29, 2025, cutting through the relative quiet of the Sitka Police Department's night shift. Dispatcher Elena Vasquez, a 43-year-old Tlingit woman who'd been working the overnight desk for nearly 8 years, looked up from her crossword puzzle as the call came in through the emergency line. The caller, a Mrs. Dorothy Henriksen of 2247 Sawmill Creek Road, was reporting loud noises and what she described as ungodly sounds coming from the wooded area behind her neighbor's property. "It's like nothing I've ever heard." Mrs. Henriksen's voice trembled through the phone line, her words punctuated by the distinct background noise of something large moving through underbrush. "My Harold thinks it might be teenagers again, but this sounds different, bigger. It's been going on for 40 minutes now, and it's getting closer to the houses." Elena Vasquez had fielded thousands of such calls during her tenure. Sitka, Alaska, with its population of just over 8,500 residents, was no stranger to wildlife encounters. Black bears were common, especially during salmon runs, and the occasional brown bear wasn't unheard of. But something in Mrs. Henrikson's voice, a primal fear that transcended typical neighborhood complaints, made Elena take particular notice. "Ma'am, can you describe the sounds more specifically? Are we talking about breaking branches, animal vocalizations, or something else?" Elena asked, her fingers already moving across the computer screen to pull up the address and assign available units. "It's like huffing, heavy breathing. And the trees. I can see them moving from my kitchen window. Whatever it is, it's enormous. My motion sensor lights keep going off in sequence, like something is walking the perimeter of the Kowalski property." Elena glanced at the duty roster. 3 officers were currently on patrol. Officer David Clark, a 28-year-old former military police officer who had joined the Sitka PD 2 years ago, years earlier. Officer Hector Ramirez, 35, a 12-year veteran who had transferred from Anchorage after his wife Sarah was offered a teaching position at the local high school, and Officer Paige McCarthy, 26, who had been with the department for just over a year after graduating from the Alaska Law Enforcement Training Academy in Sitka. The Sawmill Creek Road area was approximately 4 miles southeast of downtown Sitka, nestled in a heavily forested section where residential properties backed up against thousands of acres of Tongass National Forest. The neighborhood consisted primarily of single-family homes on lots ranging from 1 to 5 acres, with many properties featuring extensive wooded areas that provided both privacy and, unfortunately, ideal habitat for wildlife. Elena keyed her radio. Unit 23, Unit 47, and Unit 51 respond to a noise disturbance at 2247 Sawmill Creek Road. Caller reports large unidentified sounds coming from wooded area behind neighboring property. Possible wildlife involvement. Officer David Clark was the first to respond. He was currently positioned on Halibut Point Road, completing paperwork from an earlier domestic dispute call. Clark, whose military background included 2 deployments to Afghanistan with the 25th Infantry Division, had developed an appreciation for Alaska's wilderness during hunting trips with his girlfriend Rebecca Martinez, a nurse at SEARHC Sitka Community Hospital. His 6'2" frame and methodical approach to police work had earned him respect among his colleagues and supervisors. Unit 23 responding. Clark's voice came through clearly. ETA approximately 12 minutes. Officer Hector Ramirez, currently parked outside the downtown Westmark Sitka Hotel after checking on a report of suspicious activity, was next to respond. Ramirez, a stocky man with graying temples and weathered hands that spoke to his earlier years as a commercial fisherman in Prince William Sound, had seen his share of wildlife encounters during his time in Anchorage. He and his wife Sarah had moved to Sitka specifically for the smaller community feel and what they perceived as safer working conditions. Unit 47 en route, ETA 15 minutes, Ramirez reported, starting his patrol vehicle and heading toward the Sawmill Creek Road area. Officer Paige McCarthy, the newest member of the team, was conducting a routine patrol of the O'Connell Bridge area when the call came through. McCarthy, originally from Fairbanks, had specifically requested assignment to Sitka after completing her academy training, drawn by the community-oriented policing opportunities and the chance to work in a more scenic environment. Her 5'6" frame belied her determination and physical fitness. She had been a competitive cross-country runner at the University of Alaska Fairbanks before deciding on a career in law enforcement. Unit 51 responding from O'Connell Bridge, ETA 18 minutes, McCarthy reported, making a U-turn and heading south on Sawmill Creek Road. As the 3 units converged on the location, none of the officers were aware that they were responding to an encounter with a mature male Kodiak bear, estimated to weigh approximately 1,100 pounds and standing nearly 10 feet tall when upright. The bear, later identified through DNA analysis as a 23-year-old male that had been previously tagged by Alaska Department of Fish and Game biologists, had traveled an unprecedented distance from its normal range on Kodiak Island. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a wildlife biologist with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, who would later be called in to investigate the incident, would explain that Kodiak bears typically remain within their established territories throughout their adult lives. The presence of this particular bear in Sitka represented an anomaly that suggested either significant environmental pressures or individual behavioral abnormalities that drove the animal to undertake the roughly 250-mile journey from its native habitat. The weather conditions on January 29th were particularly harsh, even by Southeast Alaska standards. The National Weather Service had issued a winter storm warning earlier in the day, with temperatures hovering around 18 degrees Fahrenheit and sustained winds of 25 to 30 miles per hour, gusting up to 45 miles per hour. Nearly 6 inches of snow had fallen since morning, creating challenging driving conditions and reducing visibility to less than a quarter mile in some areas. These weather conditions would prove significant for multiple reasons. First, the heavy snowfall had driven many smaller prey animals into lower elevations, potentially attracting the bear into residential areas in search of food sources. Second, the cold temperatures and wind chill factor would complicate the emergency response and medical treatment that would be required following the attack. Third, the snow would preserve crucial evidence, including tracks and blood spatter patterns that would later be analyzed by investigators. Officer Clark arrived at 2247 Sawmill Creek Road at 12:03 a.m. on January 30th. The Henriksen residence was a modest 2-story home with cedar siding, typical of the area's architecture. Mrs. Dorothy Henriksen, 71, and her husband Harold, 73, met Clark at their front door. Both were retired teachers who had moved to Sitka from Juneau 15 years earlier to be closer to their daughter and grandchildren. "Officer, thank goodness you're here," Mrs. Henriksen said, wrapping a thick wool shawl more tightly around her shoulders. "The sounds stopped about 10 minutes ago, but we can see tracks in the snow leading toward the Kowalski place." Clark examined the area Mrs. Henriksen indicated with his flashlight. Even in the poor visibility conditions, he could clearly make out tracks in the fresh snow. Massive paw prints, each measuring approximately 12 inches long and 8 inches wide, with distinct claw marks extending several inches beyond the pad impressions. The tracks followed a deliberate path along the tree line, spacing suggesting an animal with a stride length of nearly 4 feet. "Ma'am, these are definitely bear tracks, and they're fresh," Clark radioed to dispatch. "Can you contact Fish and Game? We're going to need a wildlife specialist out here." At that moment, Officer Ramirez arrived on scene. His patrol vehicle's headlights illuminated the track pattern more clearly, revealing the full scope of the bear's movement through the area. The tracks indicated that the animal had spent considerable time investigating multiple properties, moving in a systematic pattern that suggested either hunting behavior or territorial marking. "Hector, take a look at this," Clark called out, directing his colleague's attention to the tracks. "This is a big one, bigger than anything I've seen around here." Ramirez approached cautiously, his hand instinctively moving to check the position of his service weapon, a .40 caliber Glock 22 that he knew would be inadequate against a large brown bear. The Sitka Police Department, like many rural Alaska law enforcement agencies, had discussed the need for larger caliber weapons or bear spray for wildlife encounters, but budget constraints had prevented implementation of such measures. "These tracks are huge," Ramirez observed, kneeling down to examine the impressions more closely. And look at the depth. Whatever made these has to weigh at least 800 pounds, maybe more. Officer McCarthy arrived as Ramirez was examining the tracks. Her vehicle's spotlight provided additional illumination, revealing even more details about the bear's path through the area. The tracks showed that the animal had approached from the southeast, traveling through dense forest before emerging into the residential area. "Dispatch Unit 51 on scene," McCarthy reported, confirming large bear tracks, requesting fish and game response and possible backup from troopers. Elena Vasquez, still manning the dispatch desk, immediately began contacting the Alaska State Troopers and the on-call wildlife biologist. However, the severe weather conditions meant that additional resources would be significantly delayed. The nearest state trooper post was in Ketchikan, nearly 200 miles south, and helicopter transport was impossible due to the storm conditions. The three officers convened near their vehicles to discuss their approach. Standard protocol for wildlife encounters called for establishing a perimeter and waiting for specialized personnel. But the tracks indicated that the bear was moving toward occupied residences. "We need to check the Kowalski property," Clark said, referring to the house directly adjacent to where the tracks were leading. "Make sure nobody's in immediate danger." The Kowalski residence at 2251 Sawmill Creek Road belonged to Frank and Marie Kowalski, both in their late 50s. Frank worked as a maintenance supervisor for the city of Sitka, while Marie was employed as a secretary at the local medical clinic. The couple had 2 adult children who had moved to Seattle for college and career opportunities, leaving Frank and Marie as empty nesters in their 5-acre property that backed up against the forest. Unknown to the responding officers, Frank Kowalski had been awakened around 11:30 p.m. by sounds from his backyard. Initially dismissing the noise as wind-blown debris, he had returned to bed without investigating further. Marie, a sound sleeper, had not been disturbed. Neither was aware that a massive predator was systematically investigating their property, testing fences and barriers while searching for potential food sources. The officers approached the Kowalski residence cautiously, their flashlights creating overlapping circles of illumination in the swirling snow. The property's layout included a main house, a detached garage, and a storage shed, all surrounded by a 6-foot wooden privacy fence that showed obvious signs of damage. "Look at this," McCarthy called out, directing her light toward a section of fencing near the rear of the property. Several fence boards had been broken outward, creating a gap large enough for a large animal to pass through. Wood splinters scattered in the snow indicated that the damage was recent and had been caused by significant force. Clark keyed his radio. "Dispatch, we have structural damage to fencing at 2251 Sawmill Creek Road, consistent with large bear attempting entry to residential property, requesting immediate contact with property owners." The officers could see lights on in the main house, indicating that the residents were likely awake. Ramirez approached the front door, while Clark and McCarthy continued to examine the damaged fencing area. The tracks led directly through the break in the fence into the backyard, where they became more numerous and showed signs of the bear spending extended time investigating various areas. Frank Kowalski answered his door wearing a bathrobe and slippers, clearly having been roused from sleep despite the lights being on. His wife Marie appeared behind him, clutching a coffee mug and looking concerned. "Officers, is everything okay?" Frank asked, immediately noticing the serious expressions on the officers' faces. "Sir, we're responding to reports of a large bear in this area, and we've found evidence that it's been on your property," Ramirez explained. "We need you and your wife to remain inside while we investigate." Marie Kowalski's face went pale. "A bear? How large? We have bird feeders in the back. Do you think that attracted it?" Before Ramirez could respond, McCarthy's voice cut through the wind, urgent and alarmed. "Dave, Hector, get over here now!" Both officers immediately moved toward McCarthy's position near the rear of the property, leaving Frank and Marie with strict instructions to lock their doors and stay inside. What McCarthy had discovered would fundamentally change the nature of their response. In the backyard, partially concealed beneath a large spruce tree, McCarthy had found clear evidence that the bear had not simply passed through the area. Scattered around the base of the tree were the remains of what appeared to be a deer carcass, bones, hide, and meat that had been partially consumed. The snow around the area was stained dark with blood and showed extensive signs of feeding activity. "This isn't just a bear passing through," McCarthy said grimly. "It's been feeding here. This is its territory now." Clark examined the carcass remains more closely. His military experience had taught him to assess tactical situations quickly, and what he saw indicated that they were dealing with a predator that was not only comfortable in this environment, but had established it as a feeding ground. "We need to expand our search," Clark decided. "This bear could be anywhere in the immediate area, and if it's claimed this as territory, it's going to defend it." The three officers began a systematic search of the Kowalski property and the immediately surrounding area. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing more signs of the bear's presence: claw marks on trees, disturbed garbage cans, and additional tracks leading in multiple directions. At 12:31 a.m., approximately 28 minutes after the first officer had arrived on scene, the situation changed dramatically. Officer McCarthy was investigating tracks that led toward a densely wooded area approximately 50 yards behind the Kowalski residence when she heard a sound that would haunt her for the rest of her life. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The sound was deep and powerful, reverberating through the forest with an intensity that she felt in her chest as much as heard with her ears. "Contact," McCarthy whispered into her radio, trying to keep her voice steady. "I have visual contact with a large brown bear, approximately 40 yards northeast of the residence." Through the swirling snow and between the trees, McCarthy could see the massive silhouette of the bear. Even at a distance and in poor visibility, the animal's size was immediately apparent. The bear was standing partially upright, swaying slightly as it tested the air currents for scent information. Its massive head moved slowly from side to side, and McCarthy could see its breath creating clouds of vapor in the cold air. Clark and Ramirez immediately moved to support McCarthy's position, but their movement through the snow and underbrush created enough noise to alert the bear to their presence. The animal dropped to all fours and began moving directly toward them, with a fluid, purposeful gait that covered ground with alarming speed. "It's approaching," Clark reported, his voice tight with controlled urgency. "All units fall back to the vehicles." But the bear's movement pattern was not random or panicked. Wildlife biologists would later analyze the scene and determine that the bear's behavior was consistent with territorial defense rather than simple aggression. The animal had claimed the area as its own, and the presence of the officers represented a direct challenge to that claim. As the three officers attempted to withdraw to their vehicles, maintaining visual contact with the bear while moving through difficult terrain in severe weather conditions, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The bear's approach was methodical and determined, showing none of the hesitation or fear that might be expected from a wild animal encountering humans. Officer Ramirez, who was providing rear security as the team withdrew, stumbled over a fallen branch concealed beneath the snow. The sound of his fall, the crack of breaking wood, and his involuntary exclamation triggered an immediate response from the bear. The animal charged. A charging brown bear can reach speeds of up to 35 miles per hour across rough terrain, faster than any human can run, even under ideal conditions. In deep snow, wearing heavy winter clothing and tactical gear, the three officers had no chance of outrunning the bear's attack. The bear covered the 40 yards between its initial position and Officer Ramirez in approximately 6 seconds. Ramirez, still attempting to regain his footing, managed to draw his service weapon and fire 2 shots before the bear reached him. Both shots struck the animal, one in the shoulder, one in the chest, but the .40 caliber rounds were insufficient to stop or significantly slow a 1,100-pound predator in full attack mode. The impact of the bear's charge knocked Ramirez backward into a snowbank with tremendous force. The bear immediately began mauling him, using its massive forepaws to pin him down while its jaws clamped down on his left shoulder and upper arm. The animal's claws, each measuring 4 to 5 inches in length, raked across Ramirez's torso, shredding his heavy winter clothing and the Kevlar vest underneath. Clark and McCarthy, witnessing their colleague's attack, immediately opened fire on the bear. Clark fired 6 rounds from his Glock 22, while McCarthy emptied her entire 15-round magazine. Several rounds struck the bear, but the animal's size, thick hide, and heavy winter coat provided significant protection against the handgun ammunition. Rather than fleeing from the gunfire, the bear turned its attention to the other officers. Still partially on top of Ramirez, who was screaming in pain and attempting to protect his head and neck with his arms, the bear lunged toward Clark with surprising speed for such a massive animal. Clark managed to sidestep the initial attack, but the bear's momentum carried it into him with enough force to knock him off his feet. As Clark fell, the bear's massive paw struck him across the head and neck area, the claws leaving deep lacerations that immediately began bleeding profusely. The bear then turned its full attention to Clark, pinning him against a large tree trunk. Clark's position against the tree prevented him from being knocked to the ground, but it also trapped him in place as the bear began mauling him. The animal's jaws clamped down on Clark's right leg, just above the knee, the powerful bite force, estimated at over 1,000 pounds per square inch, crushing bone and severing major blood vessels. Officer McCarthy, having exhausted her ammunition and witnessing both of her colleagues being mauled simultaneously, faced an impossible decision. Standard protocol called for her to retreat and call for backup, but leaving her fellow officers would almost certainly result in their deaths. Instead, she drew her ASP expandable baton and began striking the bear, targeting its head and snout in an attempt to drive it away from Clark. The bear's response to McCarthy's attack was swift and devastating. The animal released Clark and turned toward McCarthy with the full fury of a territorial predator defending its domain. McCarthy managed to land several solid strikes with her baton before the bear's massive paw swatted her aside like a toy. McCarthy was thrown approximately 15 feet, landing hard against the Kowalski's storage shed. The impact knocked her unconscious and left her with a concussion, 3 broken ribs, and internal bleeding. However, her sacrifice had bought precious seconds for Clark, who managed to crawl several yards away from the tree despite his massive leg injury. The bear, now wounded from multiple gunshots and enraged by the prolonged confrontation, continued its attack on all 3 officers. Moving between them with surprising agility, the animal seemed to understand that none of them posed a significant threat anymore and began feeding behavior, attempting to drag Ramirez deeper into the wooded area. Officer Ramirez, despite his severe injuries, remained conscious and continued to fight for his life. His left arm was essentially useless, hanging at an unnatural angle from the bear's initial bite, but he managed to draw his backup weapon, a .38 caliber revolver, with his right hand and fire all 5 rounds into the bear's torso at close range. The cumulative effect of multiple gunshot wounds finally began to impact the bear's behavior. The animal was bleeding from at least 8 separate bullet wounds, and its movements became less coordinated. However, rather than fleeing, the bear became more unpredictable and aggressive, moving erratically between all 3 officers and delivering additional attacks. Clark, losing consciousness from blood loss due to his leg injury, managed to key his radio one final time. Officer down. Multiple officers down. Large brown bear. Need immediate medical and backup. Sawmill Creek Road. The transmission was broken and difficult to understand due to Clark's condition and the interference from the weather, but dispatcher Elena Vasquez immediately began coordinating an emergency response. Every available emergency service in the Sitka area was dispatched to the scene. The Sitka Fire Department, Sitka Community Hospital Emergency Medical Services, the Alaska State Troopers, and the U.S. Coast Guard. However, the weather conditions and the remote location meant that help was still many minutes away. The three officers were left to survive as best they could against a wounded, enraged predator that weighed more than all three of them combined. The attack continued for approximately 12 more minutes, an eternity for the officers involved. During this time, the bear repeatedly mauled all three officers, moving between them in a pattern that prevented any of them from escaping or providing mutual aid. The animal's behavior was consistent with territorial defense rather than predation, suggesting that it was not attempting to kill and consume the officers, but rather to drive them from what it perceived as its territory. Officer Clark lost consciousness first, succumbing to blood loss from his leg wound and multiple lacerations. His final recorded vital signs, as later documented by emergency medical personnel, showed severe hemorrhagic shock and signs of impending cardiac arrest. Officer McCarthy regained consciousness briefly during the attack, but her concussion and internal injuries left her unable to move effectively. She witnessed portions of the continued mauling of her colleagues, but was powerless to intervene. Officer Ramirez remained conscious the longest, continuing to fight despite his severe injuries. His police training and natural survival instincts kept him mobile enough to avoid the most serious follow-up attacks, but he sustained additional injuries to his legs and back as the bear continued its assault. The first emergency responders to arrive on scene were members of the Sitka Fire Department, who reached the area at 12:51 a.m., approximately 20 minutes after the initial bear contact. However, they were unable to immediately approach the officers due to the continued presence of the bear, which was still moving around the attack site. Fire Chief Robert Torres, a 25-year veteran of emergency services who had responded to numerous wildlife encounters during his career, made the difficult decision to wait for additional backup before attempting a rescue. The department's protocols for active wildlife situations required specialized personnel and equipment that were not immediately available. "We can see the officers, but the bear is still active," Torres radioed to the incident command post that was being established at the intersection of Sawmill Creek Road and Nelson Logging Road. "We need fish and game or someone with appropriate weapons before we can access the victims." The Alaska Department of Fish and Game's nearest available wildlife biologist, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, was contacted at her home in Juneau and immediately began making arrangements to travel to Sitka. However, weather conditions had grounded all aircraft, and ground transportation would take several hours. Meanwhile, the Sitka Community Hospital's emergency medical team, led by Dr. Patricia Reeves, was preparing for what would become the most serious trauma case in the hospital's recent history. Dr. Reeves, who had completed her residency at Harborview Medical Center in Seattle before moving to Alaska, had experience with wilderness trauma, but had never dealt with injuries from a large bear attack. At 1:03 a.m., approximately 32 minutes after the initial attack began, the bear finally moved away from the immediate area of the officers. The animal, now significantly weakened from its gunshot wounds and blood loss, retreated into the dense forest approximately 200 yards from the attack site. Emergency medical personnel immediately moved in to assess and treat the three officers. What they found was a scene of unprecedented violence and trauma. Officer David Clark was found unconscious and in severe hemorrhagic shock. His right leg had sustained massive trauma from the bear's bite, with the femur fractured in multiple places and the femoral artery severed. He had lost an estimated 40% of his blood volume and was showing signs of imminent cardiac arrest. EMT Sarah Patterson, who had 8 years of experience with wilderness emergency medicine, later described Clark's condition as the most severe trauma she had ever encountered in a living patient. Officer Hector Ramirez was conscious but suffering from massive injuries to his left arm and shoulder. The bear's initial attack had dislocated his shoulder, fractured his humerus, and severed multiple tendons and ligaments. He had also sustained deep lacerations across his torso and back, some of which had penetrated his body armor. Despite his injuries, Ramirez was alert and able to communicate with medical personnel. Officer Paige McCarthy was semi-conscious, with signs of severe head trauma and internal bleeding. Her impact with the storage shed had resulted in a skull fracture and intracranial bleeding, in addition to the broken ribs and internal injuries from the bear's attack. Her condition was complicated by hypothermia from prolonged exposure to the cold weather conditions. The medical evacuation process was complicated by the continued threat posed by the wounded bear, which remained in the immediate area. Emergency personnel had to work under the protection of armed fire department personnel and volunteers while treating the officers. Dr. Reeves made the decision to establish a triage area at the intersection of Sawmill Creek Road and Nelson Logging Road, approximately half a mile from the attack site. The 3 officers were transported to this location by emergency medical vehicles, where more extensive treatment could be provided. Officer Clark's condition deteriorated rapidly during transport. His heart stopped twice, requiring CPR and defibrillation to restore cardiac rhythm. Dr. Reeves made the decision to perform an emergency blood transfusion in the field, using blood products that had been rushed from the hospital. At 1:47 a.m., approximately 1 hour and 16 minutes after the initial attack, Officer David Clark was pronounced dead due to massive blood loss and cardiac arrest. All efforts to resuscitate him had failed, and his injuries were determined to be incompatible with life. Officers Ramirez and McCarthy were transported to Sitka Community Hospital, where emergency surgery was immediately initiated. Dr. Reeves assembled a surgical team that included Dr. Michael Petroff, the hospital's general surgeon, and Dr. Lisa Chen, an orthopedic specialist who had been called in from home. The surgical efforts to save Ramirez and McCarthy would continue for the next 8 hours, involving multiple procedures to repair damage from the bear attack and prevent complications from their injuries. Meanwhile, the search for the wounded bear continued throughout the night. Alaska State Trooper Sergeant William Hayes, who had arrived from Ketchikan via emergency flight, coordinated the search efforts with local law enforcement and volunteer hunters. At 3:12 a.m., the bear was found approximately half a mile from the attack site, deceased from its gunshot wounds. The animal had traveled into dense forest before succumbing to blood loss and organ damage from the multiple bullet impacts. Dr. Jennifer Walsh arrived in Sitka at 6:30 a.m. and immediately began examining the bear carcass and the attack site. Her preliminary findings confirmed that the animal was an adult male Kodiak bear, far outside its normal range and exhibiting unusual behavioral patterns that had brought it into conflict with humans. The investigation into the attack would continue for several weeks, involving multiple agencies and specialists. The final report would conclude that the bear's presence in Sitka represented an unprecedented wildlife event, and that the officers had responded appropriately given the circumstances they encountered. Officer Hector Ramirez survived his injuries, but required multiple surgeries and extensive rehabilitation. His left arm never regained full function, and he was medically retired from law enforcement 6 months after the attack. He and his wife Sarah relocated to Phoenix, Arizona, where the climate was better for his recovery and where they could be closer to Sarah's family. Officer Paige McCarthy's recovery was complicated by her head injury, which resulted in permanent cognitive impairment and chronic headaches. She was unable to return to active duty and was also medically retired. She eventually moved back to Fairbanks to be closer to her family and pursued a career in victim advocacy, using her experience to help others who had survived traumatic events. The Sitka Police Department implemented significant changes in equipment and protocols following the attack. All officers were equipped with bear spray and larger caliber backup weapons, and new training programs were instituted for wildlife encounters. A memorial service for Officer David Clark was held at the Sitka Pioneer Hall on February 8, 2025, attended by law enforcement personnel from throughout Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. Clark was posthumously awarded the Medal of Valor by the Alaska Association of Chiefs of Police and the Purple Heart by the Veterans of Foreign Wars for his military service. The attack on Sawmill Creek Road became a case study for wildlife biologists and law enforcement trainers throughout North America. The unprecedented nature of a Kodiak bear's presence in southeast Alaska, combined with the extreme violence of the encounter, led to new research into climate change impacts on wildlife behavior and migration patterns. Mrs. Dorothy Henriksen, whose initial call had brought the officers to the scene, struggled with guilt over the outcome of the incident. She required counseling and support from her family and community to cope with the knowledge that her call for help had resulted in such tragedy. The Kowalski family, on whose property the attack occurred, sold their home and moved to Oregon within 6 months of the incident. They were unable to continue living in a location that held such traumatic memories, and Frank Kowalski took early retirement due to stress-related health problems. The economic impact on the Sitka community was significant, as the incident received national media attention and affected tourism to the area. The city implemented new wildlife management protocols and increased funding for fish and game services to prevent similar encounters. Dr. Patricia Reeves, who had led the medical response, was recognized with the Emergency Medical Services Provider of the Year award by the Alaska Department of Health and Social Services. Her quick decision-making and surgical skills were credited with saving the lives of Officers Ramirez and McCarthy. The psychological impact on the first responders who witnessed the aftermath of the attack led to the implementation of mandatory counseling services for all emergency personnel in the Sitka area. Several firefighters and EMTs required extended therapy to deal with the trauma of the scene they had encountered. Elena Vasquez, the dispatcher who had initially received the call, experienced survivor's guilt and post-traumatic stress disorder. She took a leave of absence from her position and eventually transferred to an administrative role within the city government, where she did not have to handle emergency calls. The bear carcass was examined extensively by wildlife biologists and pathologists. Tissue samples were sent to laboratories across the United States for analysis, leading to new understanding of the factors that could drive a Kodiak bear to travel such distances from its natural habitat. The investigation revealed that the bear had likely been traveling for several weeks before the encounter, following salmon runs and seasonal food sources that had been disrupted by unusual weather patterns. Climate change was identified as a probable contributing factor to the bear's displacement from its normal range. Legal proceedings related to the incident continued for over 2 years, with workmen's compensation claims, survivor benefits, and liability issues requiring extensive litigation. The families of all 3 officers received financial settlements from the city of Sitka and the state of Alaska. The incident led to changes in bear management policies throughout Alaska. With increased funding for research into human-wildlife conflicts and new protocols for emergency response to large predator encounters. 5 years after the attack, a memorial plaque was installed at the Sitka Police Department honoring Officer David Clark and recognizing the service of Officers Ramirez and McCarthy. The plaque reads, "In memory of Officer David Clark, who gave his life in service to his community, and in honor of Officers Hector Ramirez and Paige McCarthy, who survived to continue serving others." The January 29, 2025 bear attack in Sitka, Alaska remains one of the most severe wildlife encounters involving law enforcement personnel in North American history. The incident serves as a sobering reminder of the dangers faced by those who protect and serve in Alaska's wilderness communities and the unpredictable nature of wildlife behavior in a changing environment. The legacy of that terrifying night continues to influence law enforcement training, wildlife management policies, and emergency response protocols throughout Alaska and the broader North American wilderness areas where humans and large predators share the same landscape. The next stories, When the Wild Came Calling. The morning mist clung to the Flathead Valley like a shroud, and Derek Williams should have taken it as an omen. Standing at the edge of Kalispell High School's practice field at 6:47 a.m. on September 3, 2024, the veteran football coach surveyed the freshly painted yard lines that stretched toward the distant peaks of Glacier National Park. At 52, Derek had been coaching for 28 years, and he'd never seen conditions quite like this. The air thick with humidity despite the approaching autumn, an unseasonable warmth that had the local wildlife behaving strangely. Derek took a long sip from his thermos, the bitter coffee doing little to shake the unease that had been building in his chest since dawn. His wife Sarah had noticed it too, the way he'd been pacing their kitchen since 5 a.m., checking and rechecking his practice roster. "Just nerves about the season opener," he'd told her, but that wasn't entirely true. Something felt different about today, though he couldn't put his finger on what. The Kalispell Braves had won the state championship 3 years running under Derek's leadership, and the pressure to maintain their dominance weighed heavily on his broad shoulders. Standing 6'2" with graying temples and hands, scarred from decades of farm work before he'd found his calling in education, Derek commanded respect from his players through a combination of firm discipline and genuine care. He knew each of his 53 varsity players by name, knew their families, their struggles, their dreams of college scholarships. Marcus Chen, the team's star quarterback, arrived first as always, his black BMW pulling into the parking lot at exactly 7:15 a.m. The 17-year-old was methodical in everything he did, from his pre-practice stretching routine to his post-game film analysis. His parents, Dr. James Chen and attorney Linda Chen, had immigrated from Taiwan when Marcus was 3, and they'd instilled in him a work ethic that bordered on obsessive. Marcus jogged onto the field, his breath visible in the cool air, and nodded respectfully to Coach Williams. "Morning, Coach. You see the weather report? They're calling for thunderstorms this afternoon." Derek glanced at the clear sky, noting how the mountains seemed closer than usual in the strange light. "We'll be done long before then, son. How's the shoulder feeling?" Marcus rotated his throwing arm, working out the stiffness from yesterday's scrimmage. "Good as new. Ready to show state what we're made of." The rest of the team began filtering in over the next 15 minutes. There was Tommy Rodriguez, the massive offensive lineman whose father worked the night shift at the aluminum plant, so he could attend every one of Tommy's games. Jessica Martinez, the team's first female kicker in school history, whose accuracy from 40 yards out had earned her a full ride to Montana State. The Kowalski twins, defensive backs whose Polish grandparents had settled in the valley after World War II, and who communicated on the field in a mixture of English and their grandmother's native tongue. By 7:45 a.m., all 53 players were assembled in the pre-dawn gloom, their breath creating a fog bank above the huddle as Derek addressed them. The coach's voice carried clearly across the field, a familiar baritone that had delivered countless pep talks over the years. "Gentlemen, ladies, in 4 days we face the Missoula Spartans in our season opener. They've been studying our game tape all summer, looking for weaknesses, waiting for us to get comfortable. Today, we show them we're anything but comfortable. We show them we're hungry. What none of them could have known was that they weren't the only hungry predators on the field that morning. The grizzly bear that would later be designated as Bear Number 347 by Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks had been tracking human scent for the better part of 3 days. A massive boar weighing close to 600 pounds, he'd been displaced from his usual territory by a combination of drought conditions and increased human activity in the backcountry. At 23 years old, he was in his prime, with claws that measured nearly 4 inches and bite force exceeding 1,200 pounds per square inch. Dr. Amanda Foster, the state's leading bear biologist, would later testify that Bear Number 347 had shown no prior aggressive behavior toward humans. His GPS collar data revealed a pattern of successful foraging and normal seasonal behavior until early August, when something had shifted. The collar's last recorded position was 2.3 miles northeast of the high school, in a dense thicket along the Stillwater River. The bear had been drawn by the scent of food waste from a nearby restaurant. But as he'd moved closer to civilization, other smells had captured his attention. The synthetic materials of the football equipment, the sweat and adrenaline of young athletes, the unfamiliar sounds of whistles and shouting, all of it had combined to create a sensory cocktail that triggered something deep in his predatory instincts. At 8:12 a.m., as the team finished their warm-up laps, Derek noticed movement in the tree line beyond the north end zone. It was subtle, just a shifting of shadows among the lodgepole pines, but his years spent hunting in these same mountains had taught him to trust his peripheral vision. He paused, squinting into the gloom, but saw nothing conclusive. "Coach?" Marcus had approached, following his gaze. "Everything okay?" "Probably just a deer," Derek said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Let's get started on drills. I want the offensive line working on pass protection, and I want to see some fire in those hits." The practice proceeded normally for the next 27 minutes. The players ran through their formations with the precision that had made them state champions, their cleats churning up the dew-soaked grass. The sound of shoulder pads colliding echoed across the valley, punctuated by Derek's whistle and his constant encouragement. "That's it, Rodriguez. Drive through the hit. Chen, I need you reading that safety before the snap." In the bleachers, a handful of early rising parents had gathered to watch the practice. Among them was Susan Walsh, a local photographer who documented the team's activities for the school newspaper. She'd arrived at 8:30 a.m. with her Canon camera, hoping to capture some dynamic action shots for the upcoming season preview article. Susan was adjusting her telephoto lens when she first spotted the bear at 8:39 a.m. He was standing approximately 50 yards from the north goalposts, partially concealed by a cluster of serviceberry bushes. Even at that distance, his massive size was unmistakable. Susan's breath caught in her throat as she fumbled for her phone, torn between capturing the moment and alerting someone to the danger. "Oh my God," she whispered, her hands shaking as she tried to focus her camera. Through the viewfinder, she could see the bear's dark eyes fixed intently on the players. His massive head swayed slightly as he tracked their movements, and she could see the muscles rippling beneath his thick coat. On the field, the team was running a passing drill, with Marcus throwing to his receivers as they ran precise patterns. The quarterback had just released a perfect spiral to wide receiver David Park when the bear made his decision. At 8:41 a.m. and 37 seconds, bear number 347 broke from the tree line at a full charge. A grizzly bear can reach speeds of up to 35 miles per hour, faster than any human has ever run. The distance from the trees to the nearest player, Tommy Rodriguez, who was running a blocking drill near the sideline, was approximately 120 yards. At the bear's top speed, that distance could be covered in less than 10 seconds. But this bear wasn't running in a straight line. His path curved toward the center of the field, where the largest concentration of players was gathered around Coach Williams. Susan Walsh's camera captured the exact moment when the massive predator became airborne, launching himself over the 3-foot chain-link fence that bordered the practice field as if it were merely a hurdle. "Bear!" Susan screamed, her voice cracking with terror. "There's a bear!" The first person to see the charging grizzly was actually Marcus Chen, whose position as quarterback required him to maintain constant awareness of his surroundings. He'd just caught a snap from center when movement in his peripheral vision caused him to turn his head. What he saw defied immediate comprehension, a mountain of brown fur and muscle bearing down on them with terrifying speed. "Run!" Marcus shouted, dropping the football and sprinting toward the south end zone. Everybody run! But confusion reigned in those first crucial seconds. Many of the players initially thought it was some kind of drill or prank. The idea of a grizzly bear attacking during football practice was so far outside their experience that their brains struggled to process what their eyes were seeing. Derek Williams turned toward the commotion just as the bear cleared the fence. In that frozen moment, the coach's mind catalogued details with startling clarity. The bear's massive size, easily twice as large as any black bear he'd encountered while hunting. The way its claws extended as it landed on the turf, tearing gouges in the carefully maintained grass. The sound of its breathing, a deep, rumbling wheeze that spoke of both exertion and aggression. But what struck Derek most profoundly was the bear's eyes. They weren't the eyes of a confused or frightened animal. They held intelligence, calculation, and an unmistakable predatory focus that was directed straight at him. Time seemed to slow as Derek's training kicked in. 28 years of coaching had taught him to make split-second decisions under pressure, to maintain calm in chaos, to protect his players at all costs. He didn't think about his own safety as he stepped forward, placing himself between the bear and the cluster of players who were still scrambling to understand what was happening. "Get to the school!" he bellowed, his voice carrying with the authority that had commanded attention from thousands of teenage athletes over the years. "Now! All of you, run!" The bear was 40 yards away and closing fast when Derek made a choice that would define the next 90 seconds of his life. Instead of running, he held his ground, spreading his arms wide and making himself as large as possible. He'd read enough about bear encounters to know that running could trigger an even more aggressive chase response. Better to make himself the primary target and give his players time to escape. "Hey!" he shouted at the bear, his voice echoing across the valley. "Hey! Over here!" The grizzly's massive head swiveled toward the sound, and for a moment, just a moment, it seemed as though the animal might veer away. But then something shifted in its demeanor, some primal switch that transformed curiosity into lethal intent. Bear number 347 had made his choice. Marcus Chen would later tell investigators that he'd made it approximately 15 yards toward the school building when he heard the impact. The sound, he said, was unlike anything he'd ever heard. A combination of crushing metal, tearing fabric, and something wet that he didn't want to think about too carefully. When Marcus turned back, Coach Williams was on the ground. The initial contact had lasted less than 2 seconds. The bear's massive weight, estimated at 580 pounds by the subsequent necropsy, had driven Derek to the turf with tremendous force. The coach's helmet, ironically one he'd been wearing to demonstrate proper tackling technique, had likely saved his life in those first crucial moments. But what happened next would haunt the survivors for years to come. The bear didn't immediately attack. Instead, it seemed to study its prize, circling Derek's prone form with the methodical patience of an apex predator that knew its prey had nowhere to go. Susan Walsh's camera continued to click, capturing images that would later be sealed by court order after being deemed too disturbing for public release. Derek was conscious and moving, trying to roll into a protective position as he'd been taught during the wildlife safety course all outdoor educators were required to take. He tucked his chin, protecting his neck, and covered the back of his head with his hands. For a moment, it seemed as though his training might save him. Then the bear's massive paw swept down. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the trauma surgeon who would later treat Derek's injuries, estimated that the bear's claws generated over 400 pounds of force per square inch. The first swipe tore through his jacket and shoulder pads as if they were tissue paper, opening 3 parallel gashes that went down to the bone. Derek's scream echoed across the valley, a sound of agony that froze the fleeing players in their tracks. "Don't look back!" Now Tommy Rodriguez shouted to his teammates, even as tears streamed down his face. "Keep running." But Jessica Martinez couldn't help herself. The 17-year-old kicker turned just in time to see the bear's massive jaws close around Coach Williams's left arm. The sound of breaking bones was audible even at a distance of 60 yards. Jessica would spend the next 8 months in therapy, but she would never forget the sight of her coach. The man who had believed in her when others said girls couldn't play football, fighting for his life against an enemy that was simply too large, too strong, too utterly implacable to defeat. The attack continued for another 37 seconds, though to the witnesses it felt like hours. The bear seemed almost playful at times, batting at Derek's protective gear, investigating this strange creature that smelled of synthetic materials and human sweat. But there was nothing playful about the damage being inflicted. Derek's right leg was broken in 2 places when the bear stepped on it, while repositioning for a better angle of attack. His ribs cracked under the pressure of those massive jaws as the grizzly attempted to shake him like a dog with a chew toy. Blood began to pool on the artificial turf, dark and viscous in the morning light. But Derek Williams was not going quietly. Even as his body was being systematically destroyed, the coach continued to fight. He managed to roll onto his back and drove his fist into the bear's sensitive nose, a blow that surprised the animal and caused it to rear back momentarily. In that brief respite, Derek looked toward his fleeing players and summoned enough breath to shout one final instruction: "Tell my wife I love her." The words carried across the field with startling clarity, reaching the ears of every person present. They would echo in the memories of those who heard them for the rest of their lives. Meanwhile, help was finally on the way. Susan Walsh's frantic 911 call had been logged at 8:42 a.m., just 28 seconds after the bear had first charged onto the field. The Flathead County dispatcher, Rebecca Torres, had initially thought she was dealing with a prank call. "Ma'am, did you say there's a bear attacking someone at the high school?" "Yes!" Susan had screamed into her phone, never taking her eyes off the horrific scene unfolding before her. "A huge bear! It's killing the coach! Send everything! Send everything!" The first emergency responders to be notified were the Kalispell Police Department patrol units, followed immediately by the Flathead County Sheriff's Office and Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks. Within minutes, every available emergency vehicle in the valley was racing toward the high school, their sirens wailing across the early morning quiet. Officer Jake Morrison was the first law enforcement officer to arrive on scene, pulling into the school parking lot at 8:47 a.m. in his police cruiser. A 10-year veteran of the force and an experienced hunter, Morrison had dealt with nuisance bear calls before, But nothing had prepared him for what he encountered that Tuesday morning. The bear was still on top of Coach Williams when Morrison arrived, though the attack had shifted into what wildlife experts later described as investigative behavior. The massive grizzly was sniffing at its victim, occasionally prodding with its snout, as if trying to determine whether its prey was still alive. Morrison radioed for additional backup and retrieved his department-issued rifle from the trunk of his cruiser. His hands were shaking as he loaded the weapon, not from fear, but from the adrenaline surge that came with knowing he was about to engage a 600-pound apex predator in a gunfight. "Dispatch, this is Unit 47, Morrison spoke into his radio, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "I have eyes on the bear. It's still actively engaged with the victim. I'm going to try to drive it off with warning shots." "Copy that, Unit 47. Be advised, Fish and Wildlife is en route with tranquilizer equipment." Morrison positioned himself approximately 50 yards from the attack site, using his cruiser as cover. He fired 3 warning shots into the air, the sharp crack of the rifle echoing off the surrounding mountains. The bear's massive head lifted at the sound, and for a moment those dark eyes fixed on Morrison with an intelligence that sent chills down the officer's spine. Bear number 347 had encountered humans before, but he'd never been challenged by one. The standoff lasted nearly 15 seconds before the grizzly made his decision. Instead of fleeing, the bear charged. Morrison had perhaps 4 seconds to make a choice that would save both his life and Coach Williams. As the massive predator bore down on him, covering ground with terrifying speed, the officer stepped out from behind his cruiser and took careful aim. The first shot struck the bear center mass, just behind the front shoulder. A perfect heart-lung shot that would have dropped a deer instantly merely staggered the charging grizzly. The second shot, fired less than 2 seconds later, caught the bear in the neck as it closed to within 20 yards. Bear number 347 stumbled, his massive legs tangling as his nervous system began to shut down. But momentum carried him forward another 10 yards before he finally collapsed on the 30-yard line, less than 15 feet from Morrison's position. The officer kept his rifle trained on the motionless form for another 30 seconds, waiting for any sign of movement. When none came, he cautiously approached, ready to fire again if necessary. But it was over. The bear that had terrorized a high school football team was dead. Morrison immediately radioed for medical assistance and rushed to where Coach Williams lay motionless on the blood-stained turf. What he found there would require him to take 3 months of psychological leave following the incident. Derek Williams was alive, but barely. His breathing was shallow and labored, complicated by what were clearly multiple rib fractures and possible pneumothorax. His left arm hung at an unnatural angle, and bone was visible through several of the claw wounds on his shoulders and back. Blood loss was significant, but not yet life-threatening, thanks largely to the cool morning temperature that had slowed his circulation. But it was Derek's eyes that affected Morrison most profoundly. The coach was conscious and alert, and when he saw the officer approaching, he managed to whisper a single word. "Students?" "They're all safe, Coach," Morrison replied, kneeling beside the wounded man. "Every one of them made it to the school. You saved them all." Derek Williams closed his eyes and allowed himself to lose consciousness for the first time since the attack began. The next hour brought a parade of emergency vehicles to the Kalispell High School parking lot. Paramedics from Kalispell Regional Medical Center arrived within minutes of Morrison's call, followed by a Flight for Life helicopter that landed on the football field despite the presence of the dead bear. Lead paramedic Michelle Stevens had 23 years of experience with trauma cases, but she'd never worked on someone who had been mauled by a grizzly bear. The extent of Derek's injuries required careful triage to determine which life-threatening conditions needed immediate attention. "We've got multiple lacerations, probable internal bleeding, definite pneumothorax on the left side," Stevens reported to the flight crew as they prepared Derek for transport. Patient is conscious but showing signs of shock. We need to move fast. The helicopter lifted off at 9:23 a.m., carrying Coach Williams on what everyone hoped would not be his final journey. Down on the field, the investigation was just beginning. Dr. Amanda Foster arrived at the scene 47 minutes after the attack ended, driving directly from her office at the University of Montana. As the state's leading expert on grizzly bear behavior, she would be responsible for determining what had driven bear number 347 to attack humans, and whether the incident represented an isolated event or a larger pattern of aggressive behavior. Foster's initial examination of the dead bear revealed several concerning details. The animal showed signs of recent injury, scratches and bite marks that suggested territorial disputes with other bears. More troubling was the discovery of human food waste in his stomach contents, indicating that he'd been feeding on garbage and had likely lost his natural fear of humans. This bear had been habituated, Foster explained to Sheriff David Walsh, who had arrived to oversee the investigation. That means he'd learned to associate humans with food sources. Once that happens, they stop seeing us as threats and start seeing us as either competitors or, in some cases, prey. The sheriff, a 20-year veteran of law enforcement in Montana, had dealt with his share of wildlife encounters, but never anything approaching this level of violence. So this could happen again? Foster nodded grimly. If there are other bears in the area that have been feeding on human food sources, then yes, we need to conduct a comprehensive survey of the entire valley, and we need to do it immediately. While the experts debated the implications of the attack, the human cost was becoming clear at Kalispell Regional Medical Center. Derek Williams arrived in the emergency department in critical condition, having lost significant blood during the helicopter transport despite the paramedics' best efforts. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the trauma surgeon who took the lead on Derek's case, had seen her share of horrific injuries during her residency at a Level 1 trauma center in Denver. But bear attacks presented unique challenges that few medical professionals ever encountered. The pattern of injuries is unlike anything else we see, Dr. Martinez later explained to the medical team. Grizzly claws don't just cut, they crush and tear simultaneously, and the bite force can literally shatter bones that would normally require tremendous impact to break. Derek's most serious injury was a pneumothorax that had caused his left lung to collapse. The bear's massive jaws had cracked several ribs, and bone fragments had punctured the lung tissue. Dr. Martinez's first priority was stabilizing his breathing, which required emergency surgery to remove the bone fragments and reinflate the lung. The orthopedic damage was equally severe. Derek's left arm had been broken in 3 places, with the humerus completely fractured near the shoulder joint. His right leg showed evidence of having been stepped on by an animal weighing nearly 600 pounds. The fibula was completely broken, and the tibia had suffered a hairline fracture that ran nearly its entire length. But perhaps most concerning to the medical team were the signs of neurological trauma. Derek showed symptoms consistent with a severe concussion, likely caused when the bear's initial charge had driven him to the ground. Dr. Martinez ordered immediate CT scans to rule out intracranial bleeding or other brain injuries. The surgery to repair Derek's most critical injuries lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes. During that time, his wife Sarah and their 2 children, Jennifer, a sophomore at Montana State, and Michael, a senior at Kalispell High, waited in the hospital's family room, surrounded by friends, colleagues, and members of the community who had come to show their support. Sarah Williams, a middle school English teacher who had been married to Derek for 26 years, struggled to process what had happened to her husband. She'd kissed him goodbye that morning, just as she had thousands of times before, never imagining that it might be the last time she saw him conscious. "He always told me that coaching was dangerous," she said to her sister-in-law, Karen, who had driven down from Whitefish as soon as she heard the news. "But I thought he meant torn ACLs and broken bones. I never thought—" Her voice trailed off as the reality of the situation hit her again. Her husband, the man who had coached 3 state championship teams, who had mentored hundreds of young athletes, who had never backed down from a challenge in his life, was fighting for his life because he'd placed himself between a grizzly bear and a group of teenagers. The waiting room gradually filled with members of the Kalispell community. Players from the football team arrived with their parents, many of them still wearing their practice gear. Teachers from both the high school and Sarah's middle school came to offer support. Local business owners who had sponsored the team for years sat beside complete strangers who had simply heard the news and felt compelled to come. Marcus Chen arrived at 2:47 p.m. with his parents, still wearing the jersey he'd been practicing in when the attack occurred. The bloodstains on the front, not his own blood, but Coach Williams, had dried to a dark brown that would never completely wash out. "Mrs. Williams," Marcus said, approaching Sarah with the careful formality that characterized all his interactions with adults. "I wanted you to know that Coach saved all of us. When that bear was charging, he didn't run. He made sure we got away first." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "That sounds like Derek." "The doctors say he's going to be okay," Marcus continued, though his voice lacked conviction. "Coach Williams is the toughest man I know. If anyone can beat this, it's him." But privately, Marcus was struggling with feelings of guilt that would plague him for months to come. He was the quarterback, the team leader, the one who was supposed to make split-second decisions under pressure. When the bear had charged onto the field, Marcus had run. He'd followed his survival instincts and gotten himself to safety, just as Coach Williams had ordered him to do. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he should have stayed, should have helped, should have done something other than flee while his coach fought a 600-pound predator with nothing but his bare hands. Dr. Martinez emerged from surgery at 3:15 p.m., still wearing her surgical scrubs and the exhausted expression of someone who had just spent 4 hours fighting to save a life. She found Sarah in the waiting room, surrounded by what appeared to be half the population of Kalispell. "Mrs. Williams, your husband is out of surgery and stable," Dr. Martinez began, choosing her words carefully. "We've repaired the pneumothorax and stabilized his breathing. The orthopedic injuries will require additional surgeries over the coming weeks, but none of them are immediately life-threatening." Sarah felt her knees weaken with relief. "Can I see him?" "He's in recovery now, and he's still unconscious from the anesthesia. But yes, once he's moved to the ICU, you can see him. I need to warn you, though, his appearance is quite shocking. The facial swelling and bruising make him look much worse than he actually is." Dr. Martinez paused, as if debating whether to share additional information. "I've been in touch with colleagues at other trauma centers who have experience with bear attack victims. Your husband's survival is remarkable, Mrs. Williams. The fact that he remained conscious throughout most of the attack, that he continued to fight back, that kind of determination is rare." Over the next 24 hours, the story of the Kalispell bear attack spread far beyond the borders of Montana. Social media posts from students who had witnessed the attack began appearing within hours, despite requests from school administrators to avoid discussing the incident online. Susan Walsh's photographs, while not released to the public, had been shared with law enforcement and wildlife authorities, providing crucial evidence about the bear's behavior and the sequence of events. The national media attention was swift and intense. By Wednesday evening, news trucks from 3 major networks had arrived in Kalispell, setting up live broadcast positions outside the hospital and the high school. Reporters interviewed anyone with even a tangential connection to the story: former students, local business owners, wildlife experts from across the region. The narrative that emerged painted Coach Williams as a hero who had sacrificed himself to save his players. While factually accurate, this portrayal simplified a complex incident that raised troubling questions about wildlife management, urban development in bear habitat, and the increasing frequency of human-bear conflicts in Montana. Dr. Foster spent much of Wednesday giving interviews to news outlets, trying to provide context for an event that defied easy explanation. Bear attacks on humans were extremely rare in Montana, with most encounters resulting in no injuries at all. For a grizzly to charge directly at a large group of humans, ignoring warning shots and ultimately fighting to the death rather than fleeing, suggested abnormal behavior that demanded investigation. "What we're seeing here is not typical grizzly behavior," Dr. Foster explained to a reporter from CNN. "Bears are generally risk-averse animals. They avoid confrontation with humans whenever possible. For this bear to attack so aggressively suggests that something had fundamentally altered his natural behavioral patterns." The investigation into bear number 347's background revealed a troubling pattern. Over the previous 6 weeks, there had been 17 reports of bears getting into garbage in the neighborhoods surrounding Kalispell High School. Most of these reports had involved different animals, but at least 3 sightings matched the description of the bear that had attacked Coach Williams. More concerning was the discovery that the bear had been frequenting a large dumpster behind a popular restaurant located approximately half a mile from the high school. Security camera footage showed bear number 347 visiting the dumpster on at least 6 occasions, often in broad daylight, showing no fear of the humans who passed nearby. "This bear had essentially moved into the neighborhood," explained Randy Morrison, a wildlife biologist with Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks. He'd established a territory that included human habitation, and he'd learned to see people as part of his environment rather than as threats to be avoided. The restaurant's management admitted that they had been lax about securing their dumpster, often leaving it unlocked and occasionally overflowing with food waste. While they had received warnings from wildlife authorities about proper garbage storage, they had not implemented any significant changes to their disposal practices. "We had no idea something like this could happen," restaurant owner Linda McCarthy told investigators. "We've had bears get into our garbage before, but they always ran away when they saw people. We never thought one would actually attack anyone." But bear number 347's habituation to humans was only part of the story. The necropsy performed by Dr. Foster revealed additional factors that had contributed to the attack. The bear showed signs of chronic malnutrition, despite his impressive size. His stomach contents revealed a diet heavy in human food waste, but lacking in the natural proteins and fats that grizzlies required for optimal health. More disturbing was the discovery of elevated stress hormones in the bear's system. Blood tests revealed cortisol levels that were nearly 3 times higher than normal for a wild grizzly. Dr. Foster suspected that the bear had been under constant stress from competing with other bears for food sources and territory, creating a psychological state that made aggressive behavior more likely. Stress can fundamentally alter an animal's decision-making process, Dr. Foster explained to the investigative team. A bear under chronic stress may react to perceived threats with aggression rather than avoidance. In this case, the sight of a large group of humans engaged in vigorous physical activity may have triggered a predatory response that a healthy, well-fed bear would never exhibit. The implications of this finding extended far beyond the immediate incident. If habitat loss and human encroachment were creating chronically stressed bear populations throughout the region, similar attacks could occur anywhere that humans and grizzlies shared space. Thursday morning brought both good news and new concerns. Coach Williams had regained consciousness during the night and was showing signs of neurological improvement. Dr. Martinez reported that his brain scans showed no evidence of permanent damage, and his responses to basic commands indicated that his cognitive functions were intact. But Derek's first words upon waking sent chills through everyone who heard them. "Where are my players?" Sarah was at his bedside when he spoke, and she later described the moment as both heartbreaking and inspiring. Despite having endured nearly an hour of surgery and suffering injuries that would have killed most people, Derek's first concern was for the students he had protected. "They're all safe, honey," Sarah told him, squeezing his uninjured hand. "Every single one of them made it to the school. You saved them all." Derek closed his eyes and nodded slightly, then asked the question that had been haunting him since he'd regained consciousness. "Did they have to kill the bear?" Sarah hesitated, knowing how much Derek loved wildlife and how conflicted he would feel about being responsible for an animal's death. "Yes, they did. But Derek, it wasn't your fault. The bear was sick or confused or something. This wasn't a normal attack." Over the next several days, as Derek's condition stabilized and he began the long process of physical recovery, the investigation into the attack revealed an increasingly complex picture of human-wildlife conflict in the Flathead Valley. The Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks launched a comprehensive survey of bear populations throughout the region, using GPS collars and trail cameras to monitor animal behavior patterns. What they discovered was alarming. Nearly 30% of the area's grizzly population showed signs of habituation to human food sources. The problem wasn't limited to restaurant dumpsters. Residential garbage collection in many neighborhoods was sporadic, leaving containers on the street for extended periods. Outdoor pet food, bird feeders, and compost piles all provided easy food sources that taught bears to associate human habitation with feeding opportunities. "We're essentially training bears to see our communities as restaurants," explained Dr. Foster at a public meeting held the following week. "And once a bear learns that lesson, it's almost impossible to unteach." The meeting, held in the Kalispell High School gymnasium, where Coach Williams had led countless team meetings, drew over 400 concerned residents. The irony of the location was not lost on anyone present. They were discussing wildlife management strategies in the same building where 53 teenagers had hidden in terror just days earlier. Sheriff Walsh addressed the crowd first, providing an official account of the investigation's findings. He confirmed that Officer Morrison had followed proper protocols in shooting the bear and that no charges would be filed in connection with the incident. But he also delivered a sobering warning about future encounters. "This attack was not a random event," Sheriff Walsh stated. "It was the predictable result of human behavior that has trained wild animals to see us as food sources rather than threats. Unless we make significant changes to how we manage garbage, pet food, and other attractants, we will see more incidents like this." The sheriff's words proved prophetic. Over the following 6 weeks, there were 3 additional bear encounters in the Kalispell area, though none resulted in injuries. In each case, the bears involved showed no fear of humans and had to be relocated or, in one case, euthanized when relocation failed. Meanwhile, Coach Williams began the long journey toward physical and psychological recovery. The orthopedic injuries alone required 5 additional surgeries over a period of 3 months. His left arm, which had borne the brunt of the bear's attack, required extensive reconstruction with metal plates and pins. Doctors warned that he would likely never regain full range of motion, ending his ability to demonstrate proper tackling techniques or throw passes during practice. But the physical recovery was only part of the challenge Derek faced. The psychological trauma of the attack manifested in ways that surprised both him and his family. Despite his heroic actions, Derek struggled with feelings of guilt and inadequacy. He replayed the attack constantly in his mind, questioning every decision he'd made and wondering if he could have done something differently to prevent it from happening at all. "I keep thinking about that moment when I first saw the bear," Derek told Dr. Patricia Newman, the psychologist who was helping him process the trauma. "I had maybe 2 seconds to make a decision. Run or stand my ground. I chose to stand my ground, but what if I was wrong? What if running would have drawn the bear away from my players instead of toward them?" Dr. Newman, who specialized in treating first responders and others who had experienced traumatic events, recognized the symptoms of survivors' guilt that often affected people who had lived through situations where others might have died. "Derek, you made a split-second decision based on your knowledge and training," she replied. "Wildlife experts have confirmed that your actions likely saved lives. The bear was exhibiting predatory behavior, which means it was actively hunting. If you had run, it might have pursued you, but it also might have turned its attention to the nearest available target, which would have been one of your players." The logic was sound, but emotions rarely respond to logic alone. Derek's recovery was complicated by vivid nightmares that often featured variations of the attack in which his players were harmed. He would wake in a cold sweat, reaching instinctively for his phone to call Marcus Chen, or Tommy Rodriguez, or Jessica Martinez, just to confirm that they were safe. The players themselves were dealing with their own psychological aftermath. The school district had immediately brought in crisis counselors to work with the football team, but the impact of witnessing their coach's near-death experience would linger for years to come. Marcus Chen found himself unable to focus during classes, constantly scanning windows and doorways for potential threats. His parents, Dr. James Chen and attorney Linda Chen, were concerned enough to arrange for private counseling and considered transferring him to a school in a different district. "I can't stop thinking about the sound Coach Williams made when the bear hit him," Marcus told his counselor during one session. "It wasn't a scream exactly. It was more like the sound someone makes when all the air gets knocked out of them, but deeper, worse." Tommy Rodriguez channeled his trauma into an obsessive focus on weightlifting, spending hours each day in the gym, as if building physical strength could somehow protect him from the helplessness he'd felt that morning. His grades suffered as he devoted more and more time to working out, and his parents worried that he was developing an unhealthy relationship with exercise. Jessica Martinez simply stopped playing football. Despite having earned a full scholarship to Montana State, she announced in October that she would not be continuing with the sport. Her parents, who had supported her groundbreaking role as the team's first female kicker, were heartbroken but understood her decision. "I can't be on a field anymore without thinking about what happened to Coach Williams," Jessica explained to the scholarship committee at Montana State. "Every time I line up for a kick, I'm watching the sidelines for movement, listening for sounds that don't belong. I can't concentrate on the game because I'm too busy looking for threats." The ripple effects of the attack extended far beyond the immediate participants. The Kalispell community, which had taken pride in its close relationship with the surrounding wilderness, was forced to confront the reality that their lifestyle brought inherent risks. Property values in neighborhoods near known bear habitat began to decline as potential buyers factored wildlife encounters into their decisions. The local tourism industry, which relied heavily on the area's reputation as a safe place to experience Montana's wilderness, saw a significant drop in bookings for the fall season. Most significantly, the attack sparked a contentious debate about wildlife management policies throughout the state. Environmental groups argued that the solution lay in better education about coexistence and improved waste management practices. Hunting organizations pushed for expanded bear hunting seasons to reduce population pressures. Local governments struggled to balance the competing demands of residents who wanted absolute safety and those who valued the area's wild character. The debate came to a head in November when the Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Commission convened public hearings on proposed changes to bear management regulations. Coach Williams, still recovering from his injuries but determined to have his voice heard, attended the hearing in Helena with Sarah at his side. Derek's appearance at the podium was striking. He walked with a pronounced limp, his left arm still supported by a sling, and visible scars on his face and neck served as stark reminders of his encounter with bear number 347. But his voice was strong and clear as he addressed the commission. "I'm here today not as a victim, but as someone who has learned firsthand about the complexity of human-wildlife relationships in Montana," Derek began. "What happened to me was tragic, but it was also preventable. Not through killing more bears or building higher fences, but through better understanding and respect for the animals we share this land with." He paused, looking out at an audience that included several of his former players, their parents, and dozens of community members who had followed his recovery. "Bear number 347 didn't attack me because he was evil or because grizzlies are inherently dangerous. He attacked because we, all of us, had failed to maintain the boundaries that keep both humans and bears safe. We taught him to see our communities as food sources. We eliminated his natural fear of humans. We created the conditions that made that attack inevitable." Derek's testimony was powerful, but it was not universally popular. Some audience members felt that he was being too lenient toward the animal that had nearly killed him. Others appreciated his measured approach to a complex issue. "I don't want what happened to me to be used as justification for policies that punish bears for problems we created," Derek continued. "But I also don't want other families to go through what mine has endured. The solution lies in education, proper waste management, and maintaining the healthy fear that keeps wild animals wild." The commission ultimately adopted a middle ground approach that incorporated elements from multiple perspectives. Bear hunting quotas were modestly increased in areas with high human-bear conflict, but the bulk of the new regulations focused on education and prevention. Restaurants and other businesses were required to use bear-proof garbage containers. Residential areas in bear habitat were subject to strict guidelines about outdoor food storage, and a new position was created within the department to focus specifically on human-bear conflict resolution. But for Derek Williams and his family, the policy debates were less important than the daily reality of rebuilding their lives after trauma. By Christmas 2024, Derek had regained enough mobility to return to limited duties at the school, though he would never coach football again. The decision to step down from coaching was perhaps the most difficult one Derek had ever made. Football had been his passion for nearly 30 years, and the Kalispell Braves had been more than just a team. They had been his extended family. "I know I could probably coach from the sidelines," he told Sarah one evening as they sat in their living room, looking out at the snow-covered mountains where bear number 347 had once roamed. "But I also know that every time I looked at those kids, I'd be thinking about danger instead of football. They deserve a coach who can focus completely on helping them succeed." Sarah squeezed his hand, understanding the sacrifice he was making. "What will you do instead?" Derek was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I've been thinking about that. Dr. Foster offered me a position helping with her research on human-bear conflicts. She thinks my experience could be valuable in developing new safety protocols for schools and other organizations. It was a fitting transition for someone who had spent his career protecting young people. Derek's new role would involve traveling throughout Montana and the Northern Rockies, working with schools, camps, and recreational organizations to develop comprehensive wildlife safety programs. The irony was not lost on him that the bear attack had ultimately led him to a new calling that might prevent similar tragedies from occurring elsewhere. Marcus Chen graduated from Kalispell High School in June 2025 and went on to play quarterback at the University of Montana, but he chose to wear number 52 on his jersey, Coach Williams's old number, as a tribute to the man who had taught him that true leadership sometimes meant putting yourself at risk to protect others. Tommy Rodriguez channeled his post-traumatic stress into a career in law enforcement, enrolling in the criminal justice program at Montana State, with the goal of becoming a game warden. His experience witnessing the bear attack had given him a unique perspective on wildlife management and public safety. Jessica Martinez ultimately returned to football, but as a coach rather than a player. She earned a degree in sports medicine and took a position as an assistant coach at a high school in Billings, where she specialized in teaching proper safety protocols and emergency response procedures. The surviving members of the 2024 Kalispell Braves team maintained close relationships with each other and with Coach Williams for years after the attack. They referred to themselves informally as Derek's Kids, and they gathered annually on September 3rd to commemorate both the tragedy and the heroism they had witnessed. The football field, where the attack occurred, was renamed Williams Field, in a ceremony held exactly 1 year after the incident. A small memorial near the north end zone marks the approximate location where bear number 347 was killed, serving as a reminder of the complex relationship between humans and wildlife in Montana. Dr. Amanda Foster's research into the behavioral patterns that led to the attack resulted in significant changes to wildlife management practices throughout the Northern Rockies. Her work demonstrated that human-bear conflicts were increasing not just due to habitat loss, but because of fundamental changes in how bears learn to interact with human communities. The Kalispell attack was a turning point in our understanding of these relationships, Dr. Foster explained in a paper published 2 years after the incident. It showed us that prevention requires not just managing bear behavior, but managing human behavior that influences how bears see us. Bear number 347 was posthumously designated as a conflict bear, whose behavioral patterns provided crucial data about the factors that lead to human-wildlife violence. His story became a case study used in wildlife management programs across North America, helping to train a new generation of biologists and park rangers in conflict prevention. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the Kalispell bear attack was on Coach Derek Williams himself. The man who had spent nearly 3 decades teaching young people about teamwork, perseverance, and courage had demonstrated those values in the most dramatic way possible. In his new role as a wildlife safety consultant, Derek often shared his story with audiences who were struggling to understand how to coexist with dangerous wildlife. But he always emphasized that the real lesson of September 3rd, 2024, was not about the danger that wild animals pose to humans. The lesson, he would tell them, is about the danger we pose to ourselves when we forget that we're sharing this world with creatures that deserve our respect and understanding. Bear number 347 didn't attack me because he was a monster. He attacked me because we had turned him into one. The scars on Derek's face and arms served as permanent reminders of that terrible Tuesday morning, but they also represented something more positive, the proof that sometimes standing your ground in the face of overwhelming odds is exactly the right thing to do. The 53 students who had fled to safety while their coach fought a grizzly bear with his bare hands carried that lesson with them into adulthood. In courtrooms and classrooms, on football fields and in corporate boardrooms, in moments of crisis large and small, They remembered the example set by a man who had refused to run when running would have been the easy choice. And in the mountains surrounding Kalispell, Montana, the bears continued to roam, as they had for thousands of years, wild and powerful and dangerous, serving as a reminder that some things in this world cannot be tamed, only respected. The story of Coach Derek Williams and Bear Number 347 became part of the larger narrative of the American West, where the line between civilization and wilderness has always been thinner than most people prefer to acknowledge. It was a story about courage and sacrifice, but also about the consequences of forgetting that we share this earth with predators that are stronger, faster, and more deadly than we could ever be. But perhaps most importantly, it was a story about the choice we all face when confronted with overwhelming danger. We can run towards safety, or we can stand between the threat and those we're sworn to protect. On September 3rd, 2024, Coach Derek Williams made his choice, and 53 young people lived to tell the story.